She didn't knock. Clara Whitmore put her shoulder against the frozen door of Silver Creek Ranch and shoved it open like she had every right in the world to be there because she did, and the first thing she saw was a man on the floor. Not in a bed, not in a chair. On the floor. Thomas Callahan, owner of the biggest cattle operation in Callahan County, a man whose name meant something in this territory, was lying on the bare wooden planks of his own hallway, shaking so violently that his boots were knocking against the baseboard, and there was nobody. Not one single living soul in that house who was doing a damn thing about it. She dropped her bag. She was on her knees beside him before the door had finished swinging. "Sir?" She pressed her hand to his forehead and pulled it back fast. He was burning. Not warm burning, the kind of fever that cooked a body from the inside and left the outside gray and strange to the touch. "Sir, can you hear me?" His eyes opened. They were dark and glassy and confused, the eyes of a man who had been alone so long he'd stopped expecting anyone to show up. "Who?" He coughed. It was a terrible sound. "Who are you?" "Clara Whitmore," she said. "I'm your new cook, and right now I need to get you off this floor." He stared at her. "I weigh about 110 pounds, she said, already working her arm under his back. "So you're going to have to help me. Can you push?" Something moved in his face, something that might have been against all odds, the beginning of a smile. "Bossy," he rasped, "for a cook." "You have no idea," she said. "Push." If that opening stopped you, cold, stay with me. Subscribe to this channel right now and follow this story all the way to the end, because what happens inside Silver Creek Ranch across this Montana winter is going to change the way you think about courage, family, and what a woman with nothing but her mother's cookbook can do when everyone else has already given up. Drop a comment and tell me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's go back to where it truly began. Cheque. The advertisement had been 12 words. Ranch cook needed. Immediate position. Room and board provided. Inquire within. Clara had answered it with 11. "I can cook anything from nothing. I've worked hard since age 9. The reply came 4 days later on a Tuesday, and nothing good had ever arrived on a Tuesday in Clara Whitmore's 25 years of living. The letter was brief, the handwriting shaky, and the message stripped down to its bones, the way a man writes when he doesn't have the energy for more words than necessary. "Come immediately. Bring whatever you need. There isn't much here." She had read it twice. Then she'd folded it into her coat pocket, placed her mother's worn cookbook into her bag, alongside 2 spare dresses and a cake of soap, and walked to the livery to find a ride west. Nobody came to see her off. She had stopped expecting that a long time ago. She was 25, which in 1886 meant a woman was already being looked at sideways by polite society. Too old for hope, too young to be called wise. No husband, no family left, no savings that amounted to anything. What she had was calloused hands, a straight spine, and the particular kind of quiet that comes from a woman who has survived enough that she stopped needing other people's approval to feel steady on her feet. Her mother had taught her to cook before she could read. Not because it was all a woman was good for, but because her mother understood something most people missed entirely. That food was the only language that never lied. You couldn't fake a good broth. You couldn't dress up a poor stew with pretty words and expect it to become something it wasn't. The pot always told the truth about who you were and how hard you'd tried. "You feed someone properly," her mother used to say, pressing Clara's small hands into the dough flour rising in little clouds between their fingers, "and you're telling them they matter. Don't you ever cook for someone like they ain't worth the effort, Clara. Not ever." Her mother had died 3 years ago. She'd left behind the cookbook and that lesson, and not much else. Clara carried both of them everywhere she went. The supply wagon dropped her at a split-rail fence, half buried in snow, with a jerk of the driver's thumb toward a cluster of buildings in the distance, and the information that the road was too iced up to go further. "How far is the nearest town?" she asked. 6 miles back, he said, already turning his horses. She watched the wagon disappear into the white. Then she looked at the buildings, a main house, a barn, what looked like a smokehouse, at least half a mile off through drifts that came to her knee. She picked up her bag and started walking. By the time she reached the house, she couldn't feel her hands. By the time she got Thomas Callahan off the floor and into his bed, she couldn't feel much of anything, and she didn't have time to because the man was in a bad way. She'd seen fever before she'd nursed her mother through 2 hard winters, and she knew the difference between a fever that was climbing and one that had already made its decision. Thomas Callahan's fever had been running long enough that it had that settled, dug-in quality, the kind that had already beaten a man down to his foundation and was now simply sitting on top of him, waiting. She got him onto the bed, pulled the damp quilts off, and replaced them with dry ones from the chest at the foot of the room. Found a cloth, found a basin, found water that wasn't frozen at the back of the kitchen barely. She sat beside him and worked the fever methodically, the way her mother had taught her. Cool cloth on the forehead and the back of the neck and the inside of the wrists where the pulse ran close to the surface. "My son," Thomas said at one point, his voice barely above a breath. "Elliot. He went to town." "I know," she said, though she didn't. "He'll be back." "I know," she said again. She didn't know if she believed it. She went to the pantry. She stood in the doorway for a moment and just looked. Later, she would not be able to fully explain to anyone why she felt what she felt in that moment, standing in the doorway of a near-empty pantry in a dying man's house in the middle of a Montana blizzard with frozen hands and an empty stomach. What she felt was something close to calm. 3 potatoes going soft in a wooden crate. A cloth sack of dried beans, 2 pounds, maybe 2.5. A heel of old flour. Dried herbs hanging from a nail by the window. Rosemary, thyme. Something else she'd need to smell twice to be certain of. And in the corner, stacked without ceremony, bones. Cattle bones left over from previous butchering. The kind of thing most people looked at and saw waste. Clara looked at them and saw the beginning of a meal. She looked at the whole pantry and saw the beginning of several. She went and found the woodpile outside the back door, brought in enough to build a serious fire, and got the stove going. She filled the largest pot with water and set it to heat. Then she came back and began breaking up bones. She was working at the kitchen table, her back to the door, when she heard the front of the house. Heavy boots. A pause long enough to mean he'd noticed something different. The lit fire. Her coat on the hook by the door. The smell of something beginning to happen in the kitchen. Then footsteps down the hall, deliberate, and not particularly friendly. He stopped in the kitchen doorway. She didn't turn around. "Who are you?" he said. His voice was flat and cold as the weather outside, the voice of a man who'd arrived expecting bad news and found something unexpected instead, which somehow made him angrier. "Clara Whitmore," she said. "Your father hired me." "My father," he said, "is barely conscious. He was conscious enough to talk to me when I checked on him 20 minutes ago." She kept working. "He said he hasn't eaten properly in days. I'm starting a broth. You came here to cook." The way he said it, she'd heard that tone before. The particular contempt of someone who'd already decided that what you did with your hands didn't count as real work, didn't count as intelligence, didn't count as much of anything worth respecting. She turned then. How was in his late 20s, dark-haired with his father's jaw and none of his father's warmth. Good-looking in the way of a man who'd spent years using his appearance as a door he could close between himself and people he didn't want to deal with. He was looking at her like she was one more problem in a house that was already full of them. "Your father needs a doctor," he said. "Not someone who thinks a few bowls of soup are going to change what's happening to him." "Has a doctor been here?" she asked. His jaw tightened. "The roads." "So no," she said. "No doctor, which means your father needs the next best thing, and the next best thing right now is getting something warm into him before that fever burns through whatever he's got left." She held his gaze. "You're welcome to stand there and tell me why that won't work, Mr. Callahan, but I'm going to be in here cooking while you do it." She turned back to the bones. Silence. Long enough that she thought he might actually leave. Then, "You moved him off the floor." "I was on the floor when I arrived," she said. Another silence, different in quality. Heavier. "How long had he been there?" he asked quietly enough that something else had come into his voice. Not softness, not quite, but the first crack in the wall of it. "I don't know," she said honestly. Long enough that the boards around him were cold. She heard him exhale. It was the sound of a man absorbing something he'd rather not have to absorb. He should have told me it was this bad, he said. But he wasn't saying it to her. He was saying it to the room, to the situation, to something he couldn't quite face directly yet. People don't usually write letters that say exactly how bad things are, she said. She kept her voice level. Not when the person they're writing to is already far away. More silence. I'll check on him, he said. He's asleep, she said. Let him sleep. Come back in an hour. She heard him stop. She heard him decide, and then undecide, and then decide again. She could almost feel him working out whether to push back on being told what to do in his own family's house by a woman who had been there for less than 2 hours. An hour, he finally said. Then his boots moved away. She got 4 spoonfuls of broth into Thomas Callahan that first night. 4 spoonfuls. She sat on the edge of the bed and coaxed each one into him with the patience of a woman who understood that patience was not the same as passivity. That patience was in fact the hardest form of action, because it required you to trust a process that wasn't showing results yet. His eyes were clearer on the 4th spoonful. Not clear, she wasn't going to lie to herself about where they were, but clearer than they'd been. He looked at her, and he saw her, which was more than he'd been able to do an hour ago. That's enough for tonight, she said, setting the spoon aside. It's good, he said. His voice was a wreck, but it was his voice present and directed. What's in it? Bones, herbs, water, and thyme. He almost smiled. Sounds like ranching, he said. She stood up, straightened the quilts. Sleep now, Mr. Callahan. I'll have something better for you in the morning. Thomas, he said. Reckon if you're gonna drag me off my own floor, you might as well call me Thomas. Good night, Thomas, she said. She was almost to the door when his voice stopped her. Miss Whitmore. She turned. Thank you, he said, for coming. She nodded once. That's what I said I'd do, she said. I meant it. She went back to the kitchen and stood at the stove for a long moment, hands around a cup of weak tea, listening to the storm outside press itself against the walls of the house like it had a personal grievance. She heard Elliot's boots in the hallway before she saw him. He came to the kitchen doorway. She was beginning to understand that the kitchen doorway was his place, the in-between spot of a man who hadn't decided yet whether he was coming in or staying out. And he stood there with his arms crossed and looked at her with an expression that was working hard at being unreadable. He's asleep, he said. Yes. You got him to eat something. 4 spoonfuls. 4 spoonfuls isn't. It isn't nothing, she said before he could finish. 4 spoonfuls is the difference between a body that's been given something to work with and one that hasn't. Right now, that difference matters more than you think. He looked at her steadily. You talk like you've done this before. I have, she said. Your family. My mother, she said. 2 hard winters. She made it through both of them. And the third? The question landed between them quietly. There wasn't a third, she said. He had the decency not to say anything after that. Just gave a small nod the way a man does when he's been handed information that rearranges something he'd assumed. What are you making tomorrow? He asked after a moment. Bean soup, slow-cooked couple hours at least. The flour's still good enough for bread if I'm careful. I want to check it in the morning light to be sure. She paused. There are enough bones for 1 more pot of broth after this one, maybe 2 if I'm smart about it. That's all there is, he said. That's what I found, yes. And you think it's enough? She looked at him. I think it's what we have, she said. So yes, I think it's enough. Something shifted in his face, almost invisible, and he covered it fast, but she saw it. A hairline fracture in the certainty. He'd arrived with the certainty that said this situation was too far gone, that the math didn't work, that trying was just a way of prolonging the inevitable. She didn't push on it. Pushing on a thing like that too early just made it close back up harder. Get some rest, Mr. Callahan, she said. Your father's going to want to see you in the morning, and he needs you to look like you believe things are going to be all right. He stiffened. I can't promise him what I don't. I'm not asking you to promise him anything, she said quietly. I'm asking you to walk into his room tomorrow morning and look like a son who still has hope. That's all. The rest can be true or not true. But give him that much. He stared at her for a long moment. The firelight moved across his face, and she could see the war in it, the part of him that wanted to argue with her, and the part of him that was too tired for it, and underneath both of those, the part that knew she was right. "Good night, Miss Whitmore," he said at last. "Good night, Mr. Callahan." He left. She stayed up tending the fire until 2 in the morning. The second day, he didn't argue with her once. She noticed it but said nothing, the same way she'd said nothing when she noticed he was already up when she came to the kitchen at first light, up and dressed and clearly had not slept especially well, judging by the lines around his eyes, but there, and functional, and he'd brought in wood from the pile outside without being asked. "The flower," she said when she came in. "I need to check it. Is there better light somewhere else in the house?" "Window in the front room faces east," he said. "Gets the morning sun." She brought the flour sack to the front window, opened it, worked it with her hands, smelled it. Elliot stood in the doorway of the front room, watching her with his arms still crossed. He did that a lot. She noticed crossed his arms like he was keeping himself from reaching for something, and when she turned around, he uncrossed them fast, like he'd been caught. "It's salvageable," she said. "I'll need to sift it twice, but it'll make bread." "You can tell all that just from touch and smell," she said. "You can tell most things you need to know about ingredients that way. My mother taught me." She brought the sack back to the kitchen. She said a cook who can't use her hands and nose is like a rancher who can't read land. You're working blind. He followed her to the kitchen doorway. "She sounds like she was something." "She was everything," Clara said simply, and turned to the stove. She heard him shift his weight in the doorway. Then, "I'm sorry about her." "Thank you," she said. She started the beans soaking. Thomas was worse in the morning. Fevers always were. She knew that the early hours were the hardest, but by midday, when she brought him the first real bowl of bean soup, simmered since before dawn, with the dried thyme, and a bit of the bone stock, and more care than a man who'd spent his life on working land, probably understood food could receive, he was sitting up on his own. He looked at the bowl for a long moment. "Where'd those beans come from?" he said. "I thought we were out of everything." "There was more than 2 pounds in the back of your pantry," she said, "in an old flour sack behind the crate." He frowned. "I looked in that pantry." "Men look for the thing they expect to find," she said, settling into the chair beside him. "They don't always see what else is there." He gave her a look. "You always like this." "Like what?" "Say what you mean straight out." "Is that a complaint?" His mouth curved. "No," he said. "Ain't heard that enough around here, reckon. My late wife was the same way." His eyes moved to the window. "Margaret, she'd have said exactly what you just said in exactly that tone." He looked back at the bowl in his hands. 6 years she's been gone, and I still expect to hear her voice sometimes." Clara was quiet. "She was the one who kept this place running," he said. "Not the cattle, not the land. She was what ran it. Fed the hands, kept the books, grew. The kitchen garden settled every argument before it got started." He paused. "When she went, the heart went out of it. I kept the body going, but the heart was—" He trailed off. "I understand that," Clara said softly. He looked at her. "You lost somebody like that." "My mother was everything I had," she said. "When she went, I had to figure out how to be a person without the person who'd taught me how." He studied her. "You figured it out," he said. Not a question. "I'm still figuring," she said. "But I'm still here." He looked at the soup. He took a spoonful, then another, then without looking up. "Miss Whitmore, I think this might be the best thing I've eaten in 3 years." "It's beans and herbs and thyme," she said. "I know what's in it," he said quietly. "I know what it took." He finally looked up at her. "Thank you." She nodded once. She was leaving when he said, "Elliot, he's been hard on you." She stopped in the doorway. "He's worried about you," she said carefully. "That comes out different in different men." Thomas made a sound in his throat. "He and I—" He stopped, started again. "We didn't part on good terms. When he left, I said things. He said things back. 7 years is a long time to let something like that sit." He looked at his bowl. He came back, though. That's something. Yes, she said. It is. But he ain't. Thomas paused. He don't know how to be here anymore. Reckon that's on me as much as him. She thought of Elliot in doorways. Always in doorways. Give it time, she said. People find their way back if they're given room to. She went back to this kitchen and found Elliot already there, standing at the table with his back to the door, looking at something she'd left on the counter. When she came in, he turned and she saw it was her mother's cookbook, not open, just sitting there as she'd left it, and he'd had it in his hands. He set it down quickly. Sorry, he said. I just saw it. I wasn't trying to. It's all right, she said. Is this hers? He said. Your mother's? Yes. He looked at it. You carry it everywhere. Everywhere I've been since she passed. He was quiet for a moment. What's in it? Recipes, she said. But that's not really what's in it. She came to the table, picked it up, turned it in her hands. She wrote in the margins, notes mostly. Things she'd figured out, things that worked and things that didn't. Ways to make do with what you had. How to feed people properly when there wasn't enough to go around. She set it back down. It's more like a letter she left me than a cookbook when you read it that way. Elliot looked at her for a long moment. Something in his expression had gone careful and genuine, the way people look when they're being honest in spite of themselves. That's... He stopped. What? Nothing, he said. Then, no, it's not nothing. He looked at the book. My mother had something like that. Not a cookbook, a journal. She wrote everything down, what the ranch needed, who owed what the land had done each year. Every piece of it. He paused. I never read it. After she died, I couldn't. He paused again. Reckon I still can't. It'll be there when you're ready, Clara said. What if I'm never ready? She considered him. I carried my mother's cookbook for 2 years before I opened it, she said. I thought if I opened it, I'd have to be finished grieving. Like opening it meant she was really gone. She picked up the book and held it for a moment. But when I finally opened it, it was like... She stopped. Like she was still talking. Like she'd known I'd need these things, and she'd left them for me on purpose. Elliot said nothing. The journal will be the same, she said. When you're ready. He looked at her steadily. Then he looked it away. I'll check on the barn, he said. His voice was rougher than it had been. Animals need feeding. I know, she said. Thank you, thank. He left through the back door. She watched him go, and she thought that he moved like a man carrying something heavy, that he'd been carrying so long he'd forgotten it was there, and that the weight of it was in every step he took, and every door he chose to stand in instead of walk through. She started the bread. The smell of it filled the house by afternoon. Not just the kitchen, but the whole house, the hallways, and the front room, and she imagined it moving under Thomas Callahan's door and working on whatever part of him was still fighting toward better. Bread had that quality she'd always believed. It smelled like civilization. Like someone cared enough to do the slow work of making something that required patience and warmth and attention. She heard Elliot come in from the barn and stop in the hallway. She heard him not move. She kept her eyes on the bread and said nothing. He came to the kitchen doorway eventually, and she could see on his face the thing the smell had done to him. Not sentimentality. Not quite, but that particular expression of a person in the middle of something hard, being briefly reminded by something simple and good that things can also be simple and good. That's bread, he said. Yes. From that flour you checked this morning. Yes. He shook his head slowly. I was going to throw that flour out, he said. 2 days ago. I looked in that pantry, and I thought there was nothing there worth keeping. I know, she said. How did you see it differently? She turned and looked at him directly. Because I wasn't looking for what was missing, she said. I was looking for what was there. He held her gaze for a moment. Then he did something she didn't expect. He pulled out one of the kitchen chairs and sat down at the table, not in the doorway, but actually in the room at the table, like a man who had decided something. My father and I didn't part well when I left, he said. I reckon you probably already know that. He tell you. He said you'd both said things, she said carefully. He didn't say what. I told him this ranch was a dead end. He said it flatly, like he'd thought about how to say it and decided flat was the most honest. I told him everything he'd built was going to die with him, and there was no point in me throwing my life in after it. He paused. I told him Margaret, my mother, had spent herself building something that would be forgotten in a generation. Clara said nothing. She let the bread talk, which it did its smell sitting over everything in the room. He didn't say anything back, Elliot said. That was almost worse. I expected him to fight me on it. He just stood there and looked at me, and then he went to bed. He paused. I was on the stage to Denver by morning. And now you're back, she said. And now I'm back. He looked at his hands on the table. And I don't know if I came back because I wanted to fix things, or because I was afraid that if I didn't come, I'd have to spend the rest of my life knowing I didn't. Does it matter which? She said. He looked up at her. You're here, she said. That's what he sees when he looks at you. Not the 7 years, not what you said. You came when he was sick. That's the thing that's real. A long silence. You're easy to talk to, he said. I wasn't expecting that. People say that, she said. I think it's because I don't fill the silence. Where'd you learn that? People who needed talking to, she said. You learn to wait. She cut the bread. She put a piece on a plate and held it out to him, and he took it the way a man takes something when he's been careful and guarded for so long, that the simple act of receiving something freely given is almost more than he knows what to do with. He ate it standing at the table. She watched his expression do the thing that a good piece of bread in a hard moment does to a person's expression, travel some significant distance from where it started. It's good, he said. I know, she said. He looked at her with something that was not quite the expression she'd first seen in the kitchen doorway, the flat, cold assessment of a man who'd already made his decisions about her. This was something newer, something still figuring itself out. I'll take some to my father, he said. Yes, she said. Do that. He put another piece on a second plate and carried it down the hall. She stood in the kitchen and listened, and after a moment, she heard Thomas Callahan's voice, surprised. And then Elliot's answering it. And then very low, barely reaching her through the walls and the distance, laughter. Thomas's first creaking with disuse, like a door that hadn't been opened in a long time. Then Elliot's briefer, more careful, like a man who wasn't sure he was allowed to laugh yet, but was doing it anyway. Clara picked up her mother's cookbook from the counter. She held it for a moment. You feed people properly, and you're telling them they matter. She set it down and looked around the kitchen. The fire, the pot, the remaining supplies arranged on the shelf where she could see and assess them. The last of the herbs. Enough flour for one more round of bread if she was strategic about it. The beans would stretch through tomorrow, possibly the day after. And in the storage room, she'd found the door that afternoon, hadn't opened it yet, had made a note to do it in the morning. When the light was better, there might be something else. There often was in houses like this. Things pushed to the back and forgotten supplies that had outlasted the memory of them. Value sitting unrecognized in the dark. She was good at finding things like that. She had been finding overlooked things in forgotten corners her entire life. The storm had quieted outside. She could tell by the change in the sound, the wind dropping from a howl to something lower, less furious, the kind of sound that meant the worst was done. By morning the roads might be passable. By morning Elliot might be able to get to town. She found herself hoping the ice held a little longer. She wasn't finished here yet. She could feel it the way her mother had taught her to feel a kitchen, not by looking at what was done, but by knowing what still needed to happen before the meal was complete. Thomas Callahan needed more than 4 days of broth and bread. Elliot Callahan needed more than permission to laugh. And Silver Creek Ranch, she could feel it, the whole broken, complicated weight of it, needed more than she'd been able to give it yet. She checked the fire. She adjusted the damper on the stove. She hung her apron on its hook by the door, the hook she'd started thinking of as hers, without entirely meaning to. She checked on Thomas one last time. He was asleep, and his breathing had changed smoother, less labored. The fever still there, but differently, like something that had stopped advancing and was considering retreat. She stood in his doorway and watched his chest rise and fall. Then she walked back past the kitchen and down to her room, the small one off the back of the house, housekeeper's quarters. Barely bigger than a generous closet with a narrow window that looked out at the barn, and a nail on the wall, and a narrow bed that was clean and dry and entirely sufficient. She set her mother's cookbook on the windowsill. She lay down. She listened to the last of the storm and the quiet after it, and in that quiet she heard the house settle around her, the small sounds of a structure that had been cold and silent and now had heat moving through it again, warmth finding its way into the corners, the particular low music of a home, remembering what it was supposed to be. She thought about a man on a floor, and 4 spoonfuls of broth, and a piece of bread, and the sound of laughter in a house that hadn't had it in years. She thought, this is not nothing. She thought, this is not nothing at all. She closed her eyes. She slept. And in the storage room at the back of Silver Creek Ranch, behind 20 years of accumulated equipment and forgotten supplies, and the ordinary debris of a working life, sat something she hadn't found yet. Something that would change the shape of the next several months entirely. Something that would bring the real trouble through the front door and force everyone in that house to decide who they were and what they were willing to fight for. But that was tomorrow. Tonight, the fire burned, and Clara Whitmore, who had walked 6 miles through a blizzard to a dying man's house and found a family coming apart, at every seam, slept the deep and certain sleep of a woman who has found, without quite looking for it, the exact place she was meant to be. The storage room door hadn't been opened in years. Clara could tell by the way it stuck in its frame, not from cold, like the front door, but from simple disuse, the particular resistance of a door that had been left alone long enough to forget it was supposed to move. She worked it with both hands, put her shoulder into it, the way she'd put her shoulder into the front door, her first morning, and it gave with a groan that brought Elliot from the hallway in 3 steps. "What are you doing?" he said. "Opening this door," she said. "That's just storage," he said. "Equipment, old supplies. Nothing useful in there." She looked at him over her shoulder. "That's what you said about the flour," she said, and pushed the door the rest of the way open. She was right, and she knew it before she'd been in the room 30 seconds. Not because she was lucky, because she knew how to look. She'd spent her whole life in houses where people kept things because throwing things away felt wrong, where supplies got pushed to the back and covered over and forgotten, but never actually gone. In those houses, the back of the storage room was always where the real inventory lived. She found the salt first, a full tin sealed properly, better than new. Then a smaller tin of sugar that was nearly full, which made something in her chest loosen, because sugar meant Thomas could have something that tasted like a meal and not just medicine. 3 jars of preserved goods. 2 vegetables she recognized as green beans and corn, and one that turned out when she held it to the light coming through the door to be apple preserves. She went still when she saw that one. She turned around. Elliot was standing in the doorway. Of course, he was always the doorway, watching her go through the shelves with his arms crossed and his expression doing that thing. It did now, the thing that wasn't quite hostile anymore, but wasn't open either. The careful middle distance of a man who was reconsidering something and didn't want to be caught doing it. "Come here," she said. He came in, which was more than she'd expected. She held up the jar of apple preserves. The morning light hit it, and the color came through deep and amber and rich, the color of something made with care and time. "Who put these up?" she said. She watched it hit him. Watched his do the involuntary thing that grief does to faces when it comes without warning. A small contraction there and gone like a door blown shut by a wind, and quickly steadied. "My mother," he said. Clara didn't put the jar down. She turned it in her hands slowly, letting him look at it if he wanted to, or look away if he needed to. "She put up preserves every fall," he said, and his voice had gone careful, the way voices go when they're navigating around something large in the dark. "Apple from the trees on the south side of the property. She said it was the only way to make sure we had something sweet in February when everything else ran out." A pause. "I didn't know there were any left." "This one's been waiting," Clara said. "For what?" She set it carefully back on the shelf, not with the other supplies, but apart on its own, where it could be seen. "The right moment," she said. "Some things are worth saving for that." He looked at the jar for a long moment. Then he looked at her, and this time there was no careful middle distance. He was just looking at her directly the way he hadn't done since she'd arrived. "You are a strange woman, Miss Whitmore," he said. "I've been called worse," she said, and went back to taking inventory. She found the spices, last a small cloth bag that clinked when she lifted it, paper packets inside each one labeled in handwriting she didn't recognize. Pepper, dried ginger, coriander, and one packet labeled simply, Margaret's Blend, in the same handwriting, which she opened carefully and smelled, and which turned out to be a combination she couldn't entirely identify, but that made her think of warmth and celebration, and the particular generosity of a woman who cooked for other people with her whole heart. She didn't show that one to Elliot. Not yet. She brought everything to the kitchen and set it on the table and looked at what she had. Elliot came and stood beside her, not in the doorway, which she noted and said nothing about, and looked at the assembled supplies like a man seeing something materialize that he'd believed was gone. "This changes things," he said. "It changes what I can make," she said. "Yes, I mean—" He stopped, started again. "When I looked in that pantry the day I arrived, I thought—" He paused. "I thought we were done. The ranch, my father, all of it. I looked at what was there, and I thought the math didn't work, and I started making arrangements in my head about what to do after." Clara looked at him. "What kind of arrangements?" Howe was quiet for a moment. "There's a man in Denver," he said. "A businessman. He's been interested in this property for a while. Made my father an offer last year. My father turned it down, but—" He paused. "When I got here and saw the state of things, I wrote to him, to feel out whether the offer was still open." The kitchen was very quiet. "You wrote to him already," she said. "Before you arrived," he said quickly. "The day before, when I thought—" He looked at his hands on the table. "When I thought there was no other way through." "And now," she said. He was quiet for a long time. "Now I don't know," he said. "I don't know what's possible and what I'm just—" He stopped. "What I'm just hoping for, because you made me bread and got my father to laugh." Clara turned back to the supplies on the table. She began sorting them, what needed to be used soon, what could be stored, what she would plan around for the week ahead. She worked methodically, hands moving with the efficiency of someone who had done this work for so long it was nearly unconscious. "Mr. Callahan," she said. "Elliot," he said. She looked up. "Elliot," she said. "Are you trying to save this ranch, or are you trying to find a reason to leave again?" His head came up sharply. "That's not fair." "Maybe not," she said. "But it's the question." "I came back," he said, and his voice had gone tight. "I already told you I left everything I had in Denver and I came back. What more do you want from me?" "I don't want anything from you," she said, keeping her voice even. "Your father does. This ranch does." She paused. "The question isn't what I want. The question is what you want. Because right now you're standing in this kitchen with one foot still on the stage back to Denver, and everyone in this house can feel it, especially Thomas." The silence that followed was the kind that has weight to it. Elliot pushed back from the table and walked to the window and stood there with his back to her, and she could see the tension in his shoulders, the rigid line of a man working hard at something internal. "He told me when I was 17, he said, still facing the window, that this land would be mine someday, that everything he'd built was for me, that I had a responsibility to it." He paused. He said it like it was a gift, but it felt like— He stopped, like a sentence, Clara said quietly. He turned, looked at her with something that was almost surprise, not that she'd understood, but that she'd said it so plainly. "Yes," he said. "And Denver was parole," she said. He held her gaze for a moment. Then very slowly, the tight line of his shoulders changed. Something released, not all at once, but in the way ice releases in early spring, gradually, then all at once. "God," he said quietly. "Yes, exactly that. But you came back," she said. "I came back." "That means something about which one is real," she said. "The sentence or the gift. You walked away from the parole and came back to the sentence. A man who really believed it was a sentence doesn't do that." He stared at her. She went back to sorting supplies. After a long moment, she heard him move from the window back to the table, and when he sat down this time, he sat down differently. Less like a man perched on the edge of a decision, more like a man who had tentatively made one. "What do you need me to do today?" he said. She looked up. "The smokehouse," she said. "I saw the door yesterday. I haven't had a chance to check it. If there's anything viable in there—" "I'll look," he said, and stood up. "And Elliot," she said. He stopped. "Don't write any more letters to Denver," she said. "Not yet. Give it 2 more weeks. Give your father 2 more weeks, and then see where things stand." He looked at her for a long time. 2 weeks, he said finally. 2 weeks, she said. He nodded once and went out through the back door, and Clara stood at the kitchen table with Margaret Callahan's spices in her hands and let herself breathe. Thomas was sitting up when she brought him breakfast that morning. Not just propped up against the headboard, but actually upright legs swung to the side of the bed, both hands wrapped around the cup of tea she'd brought him first. He looked up when she came in with the proper tray, and his face did something it hadn't done since she arrived. He looked pleased with himself. "I walked to the window and back," he announced. Clara set the tray down carefully. "How far is the window from the bed?" 8 steps. "And how are you feeling about those 8 steps?" "Proud as hell of myself," he said without any apology for the language. She looked at him steadily. He was still gray around the edges, still moving like a man who'd had the stuffing knocked out of him. But the flatness in his eyes from the first night, that particular absence that she'd been most afraid of, the look of a man who'd stopped arguing for himself, was gone. He was present in a way he hadn't been. He was in the room. "Good," she said. 8 steps is 8 steps. Sit back down before you fall down. "You're bossy," he said for the second time since she'd arrived, and swung his legs back up onto the bed with only a small amount of difficulty. "You keep saying that like it surprises you," she said, and adjusted his pillows. "My wife was bossy," he said. "I forgot how much I liked it." She handed him the bowl bean soup again, richer this time with the proper salt and the addition of a small amount of the dried pepper, which changed it from sustaining to actually good. He took the first spoonful and went quiet in the way people go quiet when a taste does something they weren't expecting. "Lord," he said softly, "what did you do differently?" "Found some supplies in the storage room," she said. "Salt and pepper and a few other things. Changed the character of what I had to work with." He took another spoonful. Then he looked up at her with a sharpness in his eyes she hadn't seen before, a particular intelligence-focused and direct, the look of a man who'd built something from the ground up and understood bone-deep the difference between luck and management. "Miss Whitmore," he said, "where are we exactly with what we have?" She looked at him. She considered softening it the way people soften difficult truths for sick men, and then she thought about what he'd said about his wife. "She told me what was what, and she decided against it. You have enough food for 2, possibly 3 more weeks if I'm careful," she said. "Your biggest problem isn't food. It's the ranch accounts." Elliot mentioned the debt situation briefly. "I don't know the specifics, but I know from what he said, and from the state of things here, that it's significant." Thomas nodded slowly. "It is," he said. "I made some decisions 2 years ago that didn't pan out the way I planned. The winter was bad. I lost cattle. The bank in Billings has been patient, but their patience has limits." He paused. "And there's a man named Harlan Duke in Denver who has been watching this property since Margaret died. He knows we're vulnerable. He's been making sure of it." Clara went still. "Making sure of it how?" Thomas looked at her. "Spreading word that I'm finished. Telling the neighboring ranchers that Silver Creek is going under, and they should start thinking about what they want when it does. Cutting off some credit arrangements I had with suppliers in town." He paused. "He wants this land, Miss Whitmore. He's wanted it for 10 years. He's just been waiting for me to get weak enough that he can take it instead of buy it." "Does Elliot know this?" she said. Thomas was quiet for a moment. "Elliot knows about Duke's interest," he said carefully. "He doesn't know the full extent of what the man's been doing." "Thomas," she said, "has Elliot been in contact with Duke?" Something moved through Thomas Callahan's face. Complex and tired and sad in the particular way of a man who loves someone and has learned to expect less from them than he wishes he could expect. "I don't know," he said quietly. "I hope not, but I don't know." She left him with the rest of his soup and went back to the kitchen. She went back to the kitchen, and she stood at the stove and she thought. Elliot came in through the back door 20 minutes later, stamping snow off his boots, and when he saw her face he stopped in the doorway again, always the doorway, and this time she thought it was instinct. He could tell something had changed in the temperature of the room. "What?" he said. "The smokehouse," she said. "What did you find?" He came the rest of the way in, set down what he was carrying, a bundle wrapped in cloth, which turned out to be 3 portions of smoked meat better preserved than she'd dared hope. He put it on the table and looked at her. "Something happened," he said. "What?" "I need you to tell me something," she said, "and I need you to tell me the truth." He looked at her steadily. "All right." "Harlan Duke," she said. The name hit him. She could see it, a small tightening around the eyes, a fractional stillness, the particular micro-expression of someone who has just heard something they weren't prepared to hear in this context from this source at this moment. "Who told you about Duke?" he said. "Your father," she said. "He told me Duke has been working against Silver Creek for years, cutting off credit, spreading rumors, setting things up so this ranch fails on its own before Duke has to spend much to take it." She paused. "He also said he doesn't know whether you've been in contact with Duke." The kitchen was very quiet. "I wrote him a letter," Elliot said. His voice was flat. Not defensive flat, which was different. The flatness of a man who knows he's done something that needs owning and is in the process of owning it. "One letter, the day before you arrived. I didn't know everything my father just told you." "What did you know?" she said. "That Duke wanted the property. That the offer he made was fair market value, maybe a little over." He paused. "I thought if things were as bad as they looked, if my father couldn't recover, if the debt couldn't be managed, it was better to sell at a fair price than to lose everything to the bank for nothing." "And now," she said. He was quiet. "Elliot," she said. Now I know the man has been sabotaging my father's livelihood for years," he said, and the flatness in his voice had changed to something harder. "Now I know the price he offered was fair, only because he'd spent years making sure the actual value was lower than it should be." He looked at his hands on the table. "Now I feel like a fool." "You're not a fool," she said. "You didn't know." "I should have asked more questions before I wrote that letter." "Yes," she said. "You should have." He looked up at her, startled. She thought that she agreed with him so directly, instead of softening it. "But you didn't know," she said, "and now you do. The question is, what you do with it." "I need to write another letter," he said. "To Duke, withdrawing." "Can you do that cleanly?" she said. "Without him knowing your father told you what he's been doing?" Elliot thought about it. "If I frame it right," he said. "If I say I reconsidered now that my father's health is improving. Make it about optimism rather than what I know." He paused. "Duke is smart, but he's also arrogant. Men like that don't suspect other people of strategy because they don't believe other people are capable of it." Clara looked at him for a moment. "That's a very precise thing to know about someone," she said. "I knew him in Denver," Elliot said. "I knew him a little, enough." He paused. "Enough to know I should have been more careful when I wrote the first letter." She nodded. "Write the second one today," she said. "And then tell your father." "Tell my—" He stopped. "He's sick. He's sitting up and walking to the window and thinking clearly about his ranch," she said. "He's not a child, Elliot. He's your father. He built this place and he deserves to know what's been done to it and what you did and that you're fixing it." The silence was long enough that she heard the wind outside. "He'll be angry," Elliot said. "Maybe," she said. "But he'll respect you more for telling him than for protecting him from it. And you'll respect yourself more too." He sat with that for a moment. "You're doing it again," he said. "Doing what?" "Saying what nobody else would say to me," he said. "Straight out, no softening." He paused. "Most people don't." "Most people want something from you," she said simply. "I just want your father to get well and this ranch to stand. That makes it easier to be straight. He looked at her for a long moment with an expression she was starting to recognize. Not the first expression she'd seen on him. The hostile closed-off assessment. Not the careful middle distance he'd carried for the next few days. But this third thing, newer and less certain of itself. Like a man who had lived inside his own story so long that meeting someone who wasn't in it came as a genuine shock. "Why did you come here?" he said. Really. A woman traveling alone in winter to take a cook's position at a ranch nobody had heard anything good about in 2 years. Why? She considered the question. Not because she didn't know the answer, but because she was deciding how much of it to give him. "I needed work," she said. "And I'm good at what I do. And," she paused. "The letter your father wrote said there isn't much here. Most positions advertised better than they were. That one advertised worse." I figured a man who admitted in a hiring letter that there wasn't much was probably honest in the ways that mattered. Elliot looked at the table. "He is that," he said quietly. "Whatever else has gone wrong here, that's always been true." "I know," she said. "How do you know that you've been here 5 days?" "I know it the same way I knew the flour was still good," she said. "You learn to read what's actually there instead of what you expect to find." He was quiet for a long time. Then he reached into his coat and pulled out a folded piece of paper and a stub of pencil and sat at the kitchen table and began to write the second letter to Harlan Duke, while Clara cooked, and the only sound for a while was the scratch of pencil on paper and the steady low work of the stove. And it was, she thought, one of the more peaceable sounds she had heard in a long time. He read her the letter when it was done. She didn't ask him to. He just read it. It was good. Better than she expected, precise and plausible and just arrogant enough in tone to sound like the first letter's natural follow-up rather than a reversal. "My father's health has turned. I reconsidered in that light. The family will manage the property through the difficult period. Thank you for your continued interest." "It's good," she said. "You think he'll believe it?" "I think a man who underestimates the people around him usually believes what he wants to believe," she said. He folded the letter. "I'll send it with the supply rider when he comes through." "When is that?" "End of the week usually, if the roads hold." She nodded. "And your father?" He looked at the folded letter in his hands. "Tonight," he said. "After supper." "Good," she said. She turned back to the stove, and she was in the middle of thinking through the smoked meat and how to stretch it furthest when she heard a sound from the front of the house. Not the wind. Something deliberate. Boots on the front porch. She and Elliot looked at each other. Howe was up before she could move, crossing the kitchen and down the hall, and she followed close behind. And when he opened the front door, they found 3 men on the porch. Ranchers by the look of them. Big and weathered and dressed for cold. One of them holding his hat in his hands with the particular awkwardness of someone who's come to deliver news they're not sure how to deliver. The man with the hat was named Gus Heller. She'd learn that in a moment. He had the kind of face that had started out plain and then had 20 hard years added to it, which made it interesting in the way that faces often became interesting when they'd been through enough. "Heard Thomas was sick," he said to Elliot. "Came to see how bad." "He's improving," Elliot said. His voice had shifted back to the careful, measured register he used with people he didn't entirely trust, which Clara filed away. "Improving," Gus said, and looked past Elliot at Clara with undisguised curiosity. "This is Miss Whitmore," Elliot said. "She's been taking care of the household." Gus nodded at her. The other 2 men nodded. She nodded back. "Reason we came," Gus said, looking back at Elliot, "is we've been hearing things. Word from town is that Silver Creek is done, that Thomas can't manage anymore, that the debt's called in, that the property's going to Duke inside of a month." He paused. "We didn't want to believe it, but we figured we ought to come and see for ourselves instead of waiting for news." Elliot's jaw had gone tight. "Who's spreading that word?" he said. "Specifically." Gus exchanged a look with the man to his left. "Duke's man has been in town," he said carefully. "Fella named Corey. He's been making conversation at the feed store and the saloon. Nothing direct, just—" he paused. "Just the kind of talk that gets into things." "Thomas is getting better," Elliot said. "Silver Creek isn't going anywhere." Gus looked at him steadily. "Glad to hear it," he said. But he was still looking past Elliot, looking at the house, reading it. And Clara understood that a man who had ranched next to someone for 20 years could read a property the way she read a pantry, by what was there and what wasn't, by the quality of the order and the temperature of the air. She made a decision. "Mr. Heller," she said. Both men looked at her. "Thomas will be on his feet within the week," she said. "And when he is, I'd like to ask you and your neighbors to come to supper at Silver Creek. All of you who want to come." She paused. "I think it's time people remembered what this ranch actually is, instead of what Harlan Duke's man is telling them it is." Gus Heller looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at Elliot. Elliot, to his credit, didn't hesitate. "You're all welcome," he said. "Miss Whitmore sets a fine table." Gus nodded slowly, settled his hat back on his head. "We'll spread the word," he said. "You just tell us when." They left. Elliot shut the door. He turned around and looked at her with an expression she hadn't seen on him yet, something between amazement and alarm. "A supper," he said, "for the whole county." "Not the whole county," she said. "The neighboring ranches, the people who need to see that this place is standing." She headed back toward the kitchen. "It'll be 2 weeks. Your father will be strong enough by then, and I'll have figured out how to feed everyone properly." "With what?" he said, following her. "Clara, what we have in that kitchen is enough," she said, and turned to face him. "I know you don't believe that yet, but I'm asking you to trust me." He stared at her. "2 weeks ago," she said quietly, "you thought that flour was garbage and that a dying man on a floor had no reason to get up again. I'd like to think we've established that my read on these situations is at least worth considering." A long pause. Then slowly, the alarmed expression on his face traveled somewhere new. Not all the way to confidence that would take more than 5 days and a good piece of bread, but towards something that was at least willing to be convinced. "All right," he said. 2 weeks. 2 weeks, she said. She turned back to the stove. Behind her, she heard him pull out the kitchen chair and sit down again, and she thought, there it is. The doorway to the chair to the table. Small distances crossed deliberately, adding up to something. She started planning the supper in her head, while the smoked meat heated in the pan. How to stretch what she had, what she might be able to get from the supply rider, whether the kitchen garden she'd noticed was completely dead or just dormant. What Margaret Callahan's preserved apple might contribute to a table that needed to say, "We are still here, and we are still worth something more than it needed to say anything about the food." She thought about Harlan Duke and his man in town, and the particular cruelty of a strategy that worked by making people believe a thing was already lost, so that the losing became a self-fulfilling truth. She thought about Thomas on the floor, the morning she arrived, and what it meant that he was now walking 8 steps to his window. She thought about Elliot writing a letter at this table that was taking back something he'd given away too easily, and what that meant about who he was underneath the 7 years of Denver, and the closed-off expression, and the permanent residence in doorways. She thought about her mother's cookbook on the windowsill of her small room, and the jar of apple preserves on the shelf in the storage room, and the way both of them were waiting for the right moment. It was coming. She could feel it the way her mother had taught her to feel a kitchen, not by what was finished, but by knowing what still needed to happen. That evening after supper, she heard Elliot's voice from Thomas's room. She didn't hear the words. She was in the kitchen, where she had no business being able to hear anything from that end of the house. But she could hear the cadence of it, the slow, careful cadence of a man telling a truth he'd been holding too long, and then the different cadence of a man hearing it. Then silence. Then Thomas's voice lower, and Elliot's responding, and the silence again. She kept her hands busy. It went on for a long time. When Elliot came back to the kitchen, she was banking the fire for the night. He looked like a man who had been somewhere difficult and come back lighter for it, not unmarked, not unchanged, but lighter. The way people come back from the hardest conversations when those conversations go the way they need to go. He sat down at the table. "He wasn't angry," he said quietly. "I expected angry." "What was he?" she said. "Relieved," he said, and something in his voice was still working through the surprise of that. "He said he'd been afraid to tell me about Duke, because he was afraid I'd see it as proof the ranch couldn't survive, that it would push me back to Denver. He paused. He was protecting me from it. Both of us protecting each other from the same thing. Clara said nothing. He cried, Elliot said, not with embarrassment, with a kind of careful reverence, the way a person talks about something they didn't expect to witness, and that moved them. I haven't seen my father cry since my mother's funeral. She finished banking the fire. He asked me if I was staying, Elliot said. After. He asked me straight out. What did you say? She said. He looked at his hands. I told him I reckoned I was, he said, if he'd have me. And, he said, Elliot stopped, pressed his lips together for a moment. He said the ranch would have me, and that maybe that was enough to start with. Clara picked up her mother's cookbook from the windowsill. She held it for a moment, the familiar weight of it, the worn cover soft under her fingers. You feed people properly, and you're telling them they matter. Good night, Elliot, she said. He looked up. Good night, Clara, he said. And then, thank you. She nodded once and went to bed. She lay in the dark and listened to the ranch settle and breathe around her, and she thought about the supper she was going to make, and she thought about Harlan Duke, who believed he had already won, and she thought about what happened to men who underestimated the people around them, and what happened to things that were supposed to be finished but had simply been waiting for someone who knew how to look. She thought, 2 weeks. She thought, it's enough. She closed her eyes, and the darkness was warm, and somewhere on the other end of the house, Thomas Callahan slept the best sleep he had slept in years, and his son stayed up a little longer at the kitchen table, and outside the stars were out over Montana, again cold and close and very bright. The supply rider came on Thursday. Clara heard him before she saw him. The sound of a horse on the frozen ground, carrying differently than the wind, a deliberate rhythm that made her look up from the bread dough she was working. She wiped her hands on her apron and went to the window, and she watched a man she didn't recognize tie his horse to the post outside and come toward the house with a saddlebag over one arm and an expression that said he'd ridden a long way in cold weather and wasn't particularly happy about either. Elliot was already at the door. She went back to her dough and listened. The voices from the front of the house were low. At first, the ordinary exchange of a delivery, names and acknowledgments, and the particular brief courtesy of men who didn't know each other well but needed to cooperate. Then something changed in the register. She couldn't hear words, but she could hear tone, and tone told her enough. Something had shifted from ordinary to significant. She put the dough aside and went to the hallway. Elliot was standing in the open doorway with a letter in his hand and an expression on his face that she hadn't seen before. Not the careful middle distance, not the newer openness she'd been watching develop over the past week. This was something older and more dangerous, the expression of a man who has just been handed information that threatens something he's only just started to believe in. The supply rider was already gone. What is it? She said. He held out the letter without speaking. It was from Denver, not from Harlan Duke, from a man named Preston Cole, whose name meant nothing to Clara, but clearly meant something to Elliot, because his hand was not entirely steady when she took the letter from it. She read it. It was short. 3 paragraphs. The language careful in the way that careful language is when someone wants to convey a threat without being able to be accused of making one. The substance of it was this: Harlan Duke had received Elliot's second letter, the withdrawal, and had not taken it the way Elliot had hoped. Duke was not a man who accepted being outmaneuvered gracefully. He had, according to Preston Cole, already dispatched someone to Callahan County, not to make an offer, to assess the situation personally. Clara handed the letter back. Who is Preston Cole? She said. A lawyer, Elliot said. A good one. He worked for Duke for 2 years before his conscience got the better of him. He sends me word sometimes when he thinks I need it. He looked at the letter. He's risking something by writing this. When did Duke send someone? She said. The letter's a week old, he said. Whoever he sent is probably already here. The word here landed between them with considerable weight. Clara thought about Gus Heller on the porch, his careful eyes reading the house, his mention of Duke's man at the feed store in town. She thought about the word assessment and what it meant in the context of a man who had spent years deliberately weakening a property before moving to take it. "He's not coming to buy," she said. "No," Elliot said. "He's coming to find out how close to the edge we actually are," she said. "So he knows how hard to push." "Yes." She looked at him steadily. "Then we need to make sure that when Duke's man looks at Silver Creek Ranch, what he sees is not a property on the edge." Elliot looked at her. "The supper," he said. "The supper," she said. He was quiet for a moment, running through something in his head. She could see him doing it, the particular internal calculation of a man assessing resources against a deadline. "We have 9 days," he said. "If the supper's at 2 weeks from when we told Heller." 8, she said. "I need a day to prepare. 8 days to make this ranch look like it isn't dying." "It isn't dying," she said sharply. "Your father walked to the barn and back yesterday morning, without help." Something moved in Elliot's face. "I know that." "Then stop talking about it like it is," she said. "That's exactly what Duke wants. He wants us talking about this ranch like it's already finished, so that we start believing it ourselves." She turned back toward the kitchen. "Come in here. I need to think, and I think better when my hands are working." He followed her. She went back to her dough, and he sat at the table, and for a while the only sound was the steady rhythm of her hands working, and the low pop of the fire, and the wind outside that had been constant and variable all week, like a presence that couldn't make up its mind. "There's something else," Elliot said. She kept her hands moving. "Tell me." "The bank in Billings," he said. "My father told me the full picture 2 nights ago. The debt is larger than I understood from his letters. The payment that's due in spring, it's not small. Even if everything goes right between now and March, it's going to be close. Very close." "How close?" "Cattle prices would need to hold. We'd need a full spring season without any major losses. And we'd need to find a way to rebuild the credit relationships Duke's been cutting off." He paused. "Any one of those things going wrong puts us under." Clara worked the dough in silence for a moment. "What does this land produce besides cattle?" she said. Elliot blinked. It was clearly not the question he'd been expecting. "What do you mean?" "The south side of the property," she said. "Thomas mentioned apple trees, Margaret's trees." "Yes," he said slowly. 6 trees, maybe 7. They're old. My grandfather planted most of them." "Are they healthy?" "I haven't looked at them in 7 years," he said. Then after a pause, "But my father keeps them. He's been tending them alone since my mother died. So I'd assume yes." "What else?" I thought about it visibly, like a man being asked to inventory something he'd stopped seeing because he'd looked at it too long. "There's a creek on the north boundary that runs clean year-round," he said. "My father used to talk about water rights being the most valuable thing on the property, more valuable than the cattle even. If there were a way to formalize those rights—" He stopped. "But that takes legal work and time and money we don't have." "What about the kitchen garden?" she said. "It's been neglected since—" He paused. "Since my mother." "I walked around it yesterday," she said. "It's not dead. It's dormant. There's a difference." She shaped the dough into its rounds. "With the right start in spring, that garden could be producing by May. Not enough to solve the bank, but enough to reduce what you need to spend on food for the household and the hands, which frees up money that could go toward the payment." Elliot was looking at her with that expression again, the one she kept seeing more and more, the one that said he was revising something he'd thought was fixed. "You've been thinking about this," he said. "Since the first morning," she said. "You've been thinking about how to save this ranch since the first morning you were here." "I've been thinking about what's actually here," she said. "Which is the same thing if you look at it right." He was quiet. "Elliot," she said more gently. "This ranch has water and land and trees and a good man who built it and a son who came back to it. Those aren't nothing. Those are the things that Duke can't manufacture. He can cut off your credit and spread his rumors and send his man to assess your weakness, but he cannot manufacture what's actually real here." She looked at him directly. "The question is whether you can see it clearly enough to fight for it." The silence was long. "I need to go talk to my father," he said. "Yes," she said. "You do." He got up. He was halfway to the door when he stopped and turned back. "Clara," he said, "that supper. How are you going to feed 30 ranchers from what we have in this kitchen?" She looked at him. "I told you to trust me," she said. "I do trust you," he said, and it came out simply without decoration the way things come out when they're true. "I just also want to understand how." She almost smiled. "You find me those apple trees," she said, "and I'll show you." He left. She formed the last of her bread rounds, set them to rise, and began working out the supper in her head with the focused precision of a general planning a campaign. Because that was what it was. She understood that clearly now. The supper was not a social occasion. It was a statement. It was Silver Creek Ranch standing up in front of its neighbors and saying, "We are still here. We are still worth something. And whatever you've heard, you heard it from a man who benefits from your believing it." She needed it to be unforgettable. She needed every person who sat at that table to go home and tell someone what they'd eaten and how it had tasted and what the ranch had felt like, so that when Duke's man brought his report back to Denver, there would already be a counter-narrative running through every conversation in the county. She had the deliberateness of a man relearning the geography of his own house, one hand occasionally touching the wall but not leaning on it. He stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at Clara at the stove, and she looked back at him, and neither of them said anything for a moment. "Don't tell me to go back to bed," he said. "I wasn't going to," she said. "Sit down before you fall down." He sat at the table. He looked around the kitchen with the expression of a man returning to something he loves after an absence long enough to be afraid it might have changed. She watched him take in the order of it, the supplies arranged on the shelves where he could see them, the herbs drying by the window, the bread rising on the counter, the particular organized energy of a kitchen that was being run properly. "Margaret would have liked you," he said. Not for the first time, but this time it landed differently, more deliberate, like he was saying something he'd decided needed to be said clearly rather than in passing. "You've said that," Clara said. "I mean it more this time," he said. She had a gift for seeing past what things looked like to what they actually were. She did it with people especially. He paused. "She would have seen you coming up the road and known." "Known what?" Clara said. "That you were the real thing," he said simply. She turned back to the stove. "I heard about the supper," he said. "Elliot told me. And I think it's the right move," he said. "I also think you should know Duke's man is probably already in town, which means he may show up at the supper whether he's invited or not." Clara turned. "He'd come uninvited. He'd come as someone's guest," Thomas said. "That's how Duke operates. He doesn't send anyone who looks like what they are. He sends someone who looks like a businessman passing through, or a friend of a friend, or a buyer interested in neighboring property." His eyes were sharp and steady on her face. "I've been watching him work for 10 years, Miss Whitmore. I know his methods." "Then we'll know him when we see him," she said. "Will we?" Thomas said. "Because that's the question, isn't it? Duke's people are very good at looking like something they're not." Clara thought about this. "What does he want his man to see?" she said. "Weakness," Thomas said. "Specifically, he wants to confirm that the debt is real, that I'm too sick to manage, and that Elliot isn't committed enough to stay. If his man goes back to Denver with those 3 things confirmed, Duke moves fast. He goes directly to the bank in Billings, buys the debt, and forecloses before spring." The kitchen was very quiet. "He can do that," she said. "If the bank is willing to sell the debt, and if the price is right, yes," Thomas said. "And I have reason to believe he's already been in conversation with the bank. That's what Elliot's letter to Preston Cole confirmed if you read it carefully." Clara looked at him. "You read the letter?" "Elliot showed me," he said. "All of it, last night." Something moved across his face, complicated and quiet. "I was angrier than I let on at first. Not at Elliot. At myself for letting things get to where my son felt like he had to consider selling." He paused. "But anger doesn't fix anything. Elliot knows that now. We talked it through." She nodded. "Miss Whitmore," he said. "Clara." He said it with deliberate shift, the way a man shifts when he's about to say something that requires a different kind of address. "I want to ask you something directly." "All right," she said. "Why are you fighting for this ranch?" he said. You've been here 10 days. This is a cook's position. Whatever happens to Silver Creek, whether it stands or falls, it's not your problem. You could leave tomorrow and take another position somewhere, and none of this would follow you." He held her gaze. "So why aren't you leaving?" She was quiet for a long moment. "My mother grew up on a ranch," she said finally. "Not a big one. A small operation in Wyoming that her family had worked for 30 years. When she was 19, the man who owned the neighboring property decided he wanted their water rights, and he found a way to manufacture a debt they couldn't pay, and the bank called it in before winter." She paused. She watched her father lose everything he'd built. She watched it happen, and there was nothing she could do, because by the time anyone understood what was happening, it was already done. Thomas said nothing, just listened. "She never got over it," Clara said. "Not entirely. She spent the rest of her life understanding that what had been taken from her father wasn't just land. It was everything he'd made, and everything she'd grown up knowing as real." She looked at Thomas steadily. "I understand what this ranch is to you. I understood it the first morning when I found you on that floor. You weren't just sick, Thomas. You were giving up because the thing you'd fought for your whole life was slipping away, and you were too tired to hold on to it anymore." Thomas's jaw had tightened. "I'm not leaving," she said, "because I know what it looks like when a good thing is being taken by a bad man, and I know what it costs everyone when nobody does anything about it." She turned back to the stove. "Now, let me finish this bread because I have 8 days to figure out how to feed 30 ranchers, and I cannot afford to spend the afternoon being sentimental about it." Behind her, Thomas Callahan was quiet for a long time. Then she heard his voice rough with something he wasn't going to name directly. "My son is a fool if he lets you go." She kept her eyes on the stove. "He has bigger things to worry about right now," she said. "He does," Thomas said, "but not more important ones." She didn't answer that, but her hands on the bread were not entirely steady for the next several minutes, and she was glad her back was to the room. The following days moved fast. She had learned in her years of working in difficult circumstances that urgency was either your enemy or your tool, and the difference was entirely in how you handled the first hour of knowing about it. She had spent that first hour after Elliot left to talk to Thomas, after the letter from Preston Cole was folded back into Elliot's coat pocket, making a list so specific and so complete that the uncertainty of the situation had something concrete to push against. Every day had a purpose. Every resource had a job. Nothing was wasted and nothing was decorative. She sent Elliot to the apple trees on the second day. He came back with a report that the trees were in better condition than he'd expected. His father had been tending them through the fall, as she'd guessed even in the worst of his illness, because some things a man did on habit and love when he could no longer do them on strength. 3 of the trees still had dried fruit clinging to the upper branches, frozen, but intact. He'd brought down what he could reach. She took the frozen apples from him without ceremony and went to the kitchen. He followed and watched while she worked the fruit, removing what was damaged, saving what wasn't, beginning the slow process of cooking them down with a portion of the sugar from the storage room into something that would extend the preserved apple that Margaret had put up and give the supper table a sweetness it needed. "That's going to take hours," he said. "Yes," she said. "Let me help," he said. She looked at him. In 10 days, she had not let him help in the kitchen, not because she didn't want his company, but because she understood that some spaces had to be established before they could be shared, and the kitchen had been hers to establish. But he was standing at the counter with his sleeves already rolled up and an expression that said he wasn't asking to be polite. "Wash your hands," she said. He washed his hands. She taught him how to cut the apples properly, not the way most people did it, wastefully, but her mother's way, turning the fruit in the hand and following the curve of it, preserving every possible piece of edible flesh. He was clumsy at first, and she said so, and he said something under his breath that she pretended not to hear, and by the 4th apple, he was doing it right. They worked side by side without speaking for a while. Then he said, "Tell me about the supper. What exactly are you planning?" So she told him. She laid it out with the precision she'd given to everything since the letter arrived, not as a meal, but as a strategy. Each dish chosen not just for how it would taste, but for what it would say. The smoked meat extended into a proper stew that could feed 30 people without looking like it was trying to feed 30 people. The bread in 3 varieties, because abundance of bread was one of the oldest signals in the world that a household was managed well. The preserved vegetables from the storage room transformed by the spices into something that would surprise people who expected simple winter food. And at the end, she hadn't told anyone this part yet, the apple preserves. Margaret's apple preserves the jar from the shelf opened at the right moment for the right reason. Elliot had gone still beside her while she talked. "The apple preserves," he said. "My mother's." "Yes," she said. "That's the right moment." He was quiet. She could feel him working through it, the grief of it, and the rightness of it simultaneously, which was a complicated thing to feel. "She put those up for exactly this," he said finally. "For when the ranch needed something. She always said a good table was how you told people you were serious." He paused. "I didn't remember that until just now." "Food carries memory," Clara said quietly. "That's what my mother taught me. It carries it better than almost anything else because it goes through the body. People can forget what they heard or saw. They don't forget what they tasted." He looked at her. "The people who come to that supper," she said, "are going to taste your mother's apple preserves and remember who built this ranch and why it matters. And that memory is going to be stronger than anything Duke's man can put in a report." He set down the apple in his hands. "Clara," he said. "Don't," she said, because she could hear in his voice what was coming, and she wasn't ready for it, not in the middle of a kitchen with apple juice on her hands, and 8 days left, and 30 people coming to a supper that had to be perfect. I was quiet for a moment. "All right," he said, and picked up the apple again. They finished the cooking in silence, and it was the best kind of silence, full, rather than empty, the silence of 2 people who have said enough for now and are comfortable with the rest waiting. On the 5th day before the supper, Duke's man showed up. She didn't know that's who he was when she first saw him. She was in the yard checking on the kitchen garden, assessing as she did every morning. What was there and what could be done with it before spring, when a rider came through the gate with the easy confidence of someone who'd been told he was welcome, even if he hadn't been formally invited. How was well dressed for a man supposedly just passing through. His horse was too good. His coat was too clean. And he looked at Silver Creek Ranch the way an appraiser looks at a property, systematically. His gaze moving from the barn to the main house to the outbuildings and back again. Not the appreciative look of a visitor, but the calculating look of a man taking inventory. Clara wiped her hands on her apron and watched him. He introduced himself to Elliot, who had come to the yard when he heard the horse, as a man named Carroll. A buyer, he said. Interested in cattle passing through the county and having heard Silver Creek had fine stock. His voice was smooth, and his manners were good, and everything about him was designed to seem ordinary. Elliot's face gave away nothing. Clara watched the exchange from the garden. She watched Elliot shake the man's hand and invite him in for coffee, with the exact level of warmth that was appropriate for a stranger who was welcome but not anticipated. She watched Carroll accept and follow Elliot inside, and she thought, he's good. Duke trained him well. She went around the back of the house and came in through the kitchen. By the time Carroll was seated at the table with his coffee, Clara was at the stove with her back to the room and a pan of something on the heat, which gave her a reason to be present without being part of the conversation, which was exactly where she needed to be. Carroll talked about cattle prices. Elliot talked about cattle prices back. Both of them said almost nothing of substance for 5 minutes, which was the verbal equivalent of 2 men walking around each other in a small space, each waiting for the other to show his hand. Then Carroll said, "I heard Thomas Callahan's been ill. Shame. Man's a legend in this territory." "He's recovering," Elliot said. "Glad to hear it," Carroll said. He paused, and she could hear the pause even with her back turned, the particular pause of someone deciding which door to try next. Must have been a hard winter managing things alone. "We have good help," Elliot said. And then Thomas Callahan walked into the kitchen. Carroll looked up and she saw his expression do an involuntary thing, a small recalibration quickly covered. He had not expected Thomas to be upright. He had not expected Thomas to walk into a room with that particular steadiness, worn but genuine, the steadiness of a man who was sick but not beaten. Thomas looked at Carol for exactly 2 seconds. "Don't believe we've met," he said. "Carol, sir. Cattle buyer passing through." "Passing through from where?" Thomas said, pulling out the chair at the head of the table and sitting down deliberately in the chair that said, "This is my table, and I am the man who sits at its head." Carol named a town. "Long way to pass through," Thomas said pleasantly. "Coffee treating you well?" "Very well," Carol said. "Good," Thomas said. "Miss Whitmore makes a fine cup." He looked at Clara's back. "You planning to stay for supper, Mr. Carroll? We're having neighbors in the week after next. Fine table." He paused. "Plenty of room for a cattle buyer passing through." The invitation was perfect because it was impossible to refuse without revealing that staying for supper was the last thing Carol wanted. A man with nothing to hide accepts a supper invitation from a healthy rancher with neighbors coming. A man with something to hide finds a reason to leave. Carol stayed another 20 minutes and then found a reason to leave. When the sound of his horse was gone, Elliot came and stood beside Clara at the stove. "He'll send a report tonight," he said quietly. "I know," she said. "He saw my father standing up," he said. "Yes." "Is that enough?" Clara was quiet for a moment, thinking about Carol's eyes on Thomas when he walked in. Thinking about the involuntary recalibration. "It's enough to create doubt," she said. Duke was counting on a specific picture. Thomas on his back, you uncertain the ranch in obvious distress. He didn't get that picture. He got Thomas at the head of his own table offering supper. She paused. "It won't stop Duke, but it will slow him down while he reassesses. And slow is what we need." "How much time does it buy us?" Elliot said. "Enough," she said. "If the supper goes the way it needs to go." He looked at her profile. "And what happens if it doesn't?" She turned and met his eyes. "It will," she said. He held her gaze. "You're absolutely certain?" "No," she said honestly. "But I'm certain enough to act like I am. And right now, that's more useful." His mouth curved the smallest possible thing, a movement so slight she almost missed it. But she didn't miss it. "All right," he said. "What do you need me to do?" She handed him a list. He looked at it. Then he looked at her. "You already wrote this out." "I wrote it out the day the letter arrived," she said. He shook his head slowly, not in disbelief anymore, in something that had moved well past that. "Go," she said. "I have bread to finish." He went, and Clara stood at the stove and thought about the supper and what it needed to be, and she thought about Margaret Callahan's apple preserves on the shelf in the storage room, waiting with the patience of something that had been prepared for exactly this moment and had simply been waiting for the moment to arrive. The night before the supper, she couldn't sleep. She lay in her narrow bed and listened to the ranch and thought about every dish and every detail and every person who would be sitting at that table, and she did what her mother had taught her to do when she was afraid of something that mattered. She went through it in her hands. Every step, every preparation, every timing and temperature and combination, until the whole supper lived in her body as well as her mind, and she could feel with the certainty of deep practice that it was right. At some point, she heard boots in the hallway, not going anywhere, just there, the sound of someone else who wasn't sleeping either. She lay still and listened. After a moment, the boots stopped outside her door. She heard Elliot's voice low through the wood. "Clara." "I'm awake," she said. A pause. "I know." Another pause. "I just wanted to say whatever happens tomorrow, whatever happens after, I need you to know that I understand what you've done here, not just the cooking, all of it." She stared at the ceiling. "Elliot," she said. "Yeah." "Go to sleep," she said. "You need to be clear-headed tomorrow, and so do I." A long pause. Then very quietly, "Good night, Clara." "Good night," she said. She heard his boots move away down the hall. She lay in the dark and pressed her hands flat against the quilt and felt her own heartbeat, which was not as steady as it should have been. She thought about her mother. She thought about a jar of apple preserves made by a woman she'd never met, preserved through years of grief and winter, and the ordinary difficulty of keeping something alive that mattered. She thought tomorrow. She thought, it has to be tomorrow. She closed her eyes and made herself be still, and eventually somewhere in the deep of the Montana night she slept. In the morning she started the fire before dawn, and Silver Creek Ranch, which had been dying when she arrived, which had been lying on the floor in the cold, with no one coming, which had been days away from being picked clean by a man in Denver, who believed it was already his Silver Creek Ranch, woke up around her, and breathed and waited, and the smell of bread starting in the kitchen moved through its rooms like something returning after a long absence. Like a heartbeat finding its rhythm again. Like a home remembering what it was. The day of the supper began before the sun did. Clara was at the stove by 4 in the morning, moving through the kitchen with the focused quiet of a woman who had planned every minute of what needed to happen, and was now simply executing it one step at a time. No hesitation and no revision. The stew went on first. It needed the longest time the smoked meat, and the preserved vegetables, and the careful combination of Margaret's spice blend that she'd been rationing all week for exactly this moment. Then the bread, 3 varieties, each one started at a precise interval, so they would all come out right. None of them rushed, because rushed bread told the truth about a kitchen, the same way a forced smile told the truth about a face. Elliot appeared in the kitchen doorway at 5:30. He looked like he hadn't slept much, which she'd expected. He looked at the stove and the counter and the organized progression of preparation. And then he looked at her and he said, "Tell me what to do." She told him. He did it without argument, without commentary, without the careful distance he'd maintained in the early days. He moved through the kitchen like a man who had decided to be useful and meant it, following her directions, with the same deliberate attention he'd given to the apple cutting a week ago, improving as he went, asking questions when he didn't understand something and not asking when he did. Thomas came in at 7. He was dressed in his best, not formal. This wasn't that kind of territory, but his good shirt and his good boots and his hair combed with the care of a man who understood that today was a day that required him to look like himself at his best, not his worst. He stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at the two of them working and said nothing for a moment. Then, "What can I do?" Clara and Elliot looked at each other. "Sit down," Clara said, "and tell us who's coming and what matters to each of them." Thomas sat down. He talked for an hour. By the time he was done, Clara knew that Gus Heller's wife had lost a child 2 winters ago and would need warmth more than anything else. She knew that the Brennan brothers from the north boundary had been feuding with each other for 3 years over a fence line and would need to be seated apart. She knew that old Daniel Marsh, who was 74 and had ranched Callahan County longer than anyone else alive, was the person whose opinion moved the room. And if Daniel Marsh looked satisfied at Thomas Callahan's table, everyone else would take their cue from him. She rearranged the seating in her head while her hands kept working. "There's one more thing," Thomas said, after a pause that had a different quality to it, heavier, more deliberate. Clara and Elliot both looked at him. "Carol wasn't the only one Duke sent," Thomas said. The kitchen went very quiet. "I found out this morning," Thomas said. "Henderson at the feed store sent word. There are 2 of them. Carol, who you met, and a man named Briggs who arrived 3 days ago and has been making himself agreeable at the saloon ever since." He paused. "Briggs is the one I'm worried about. Carol is an assessor. Briggs is a talker. He's been telling people that the supper tonight is a desperate move, that I'm trying to perform health I don't have, that this whole thing is a show put on by a cook who doesn't understand what she's walked into." The last sentence landed in the room with considerable force. Elliot's expression had gone tight. "Who's been listening to him?" "Enough people," Thomas said. "The Garrity family, maybe. Young Peterson, possibly. People who aren't sure yet and can be moved either way." He looked at Clara. "I'm telling you because you need to know what you're walking into today. This isn't just a supper anymore. There are people coming to this table who are already halfway convinced it's a performance." Clara set down what was in her hands. She looked at Thomas, then at Elliot, then at the stove, at the stew that had been working for 3 hours and smelled like something serious, like something made with intent and care and the knowledge of what it needed to do. "Good," she said. Both men looked at her. "If people come expecting a performance," she said, "and they find something real instead, that's more powerful than if they'd come expecting something real." She picked up what she'd set down and went back to work. Let them come skeptical. The food will do what the food does. Elliot looked at his father. Thomas looked at Elliot. Something passed between them. The particular silent communication of two people who have been reassessing the same person for the same period of time and have arrived at the same conclusion simultaneously. "All right," Thomas said quietly. "All right then." The first wagons arrived at 4 in the afternoon. Clara heard them from the kitchen, where she was in the final coordinated push of the preparation timing, everything to come together at the same moment, which was the hardest part of cooking for 30 people. Harder than the sourcing, or the preparation, or the rationing of limited supplies, because it required holding the entire sequence in your head and adjusting constantly without letting the adjustment show. She did not go to greet them. Elliot went. Thomas went. That was right. The Callahan men greeting their neighbors at the door of the Callahan ranch, and Clara, where she needed to be, which was in the kitchen, making sure that when those neighbors walked into the house, what they experienced first was warmth and the smell of something honest and good. She heard voices multiplying in the front of the house. She heard Thomas's voice among them, and she heard something in its quality that she hadn't heard before. Not the careful, conserved tone of a sick man, managing his energy, but the fuller, more present voice of a man on his own ground with his people around him, a voice that had been waiting to be used like this. She heard Elliot too different from Thomas, more careful, still finding the language of this, but present. There. She kept working. Gus Heller's wife came to the kitchen 20 minutes after arriving. Clara heard her before she saw her, a knock tentative on the kitchen doorframe. The knock of a woman who understood about kitchens and knew you didn't just walk in uninvited. "Come in," Clara said. She was a small woman, probably 40, with the kind of face that had been pretty and was now something better than pretty. Weathered into character, the face of a woman who had been through things and come out knowing more than she'd known before. She had brought something with her, a covered dish, and she held it with both hands and looked at Clara with an expression that was sizing her up without being unkind about it. "Ruth Heller," she said. "Gus is my husband." "Clara Whitmore," Clara said. "What did you bring?" Ruth looked slightly startled. Apparently she'd expected a longer preamble. "Cornbread," she said. "I wasn't sure if there'd be enough bread and I had the corn." "Perfect," Clara said. Said and meant it absolutely, because she had been quietly worried about bread quantities, and this solved it cleanly. "Can you slice it? The knife is on the board." Ruth blinked. Then she smiled, a real smile, the kind that comes when someone is treated as useful rather than as a guest. She put her dish down and picked up the knife. They worked alongside each other for 10 minutes before Ruth said, "You're the one who got Thomas up off that floor." "He got himself up," Clara said. "I just gave him a reason." Ruth was quiet for a moment, slicing. "My husband said the ranch looked different when they came to check on Thomas. Said it felt like somewhere that was still going instead of stopping." She paused. "We've been neighbors to the Callahans for 15 years. I didn't want to believe what that Dukes man was saying in town. But you hear something enough times and you start to—" She stopped. "Wonder," Clara said. "Yes," Ruth said. "Wonder. I understand that," Clara said. "It's what he's counting on. Not that you'll believe it all at once, just that you'll wonder enough to step back." Ruth looked at her. "You know what he's doing." "I know exactly what he's doing," Clara said. "And tonight, I'd like to give everyone a reason to step forward instead of back." She glanced at Ruth. "Including people who came wondering." Ruth was quiet for a moment. Then she said quietly, "My daughter loved this ranch. She used to say the Callahan place was what a real home felt like." She paused. "She died in February 2 years ago. She was 4. The kitchen was very still. Clara stopped what she was doing and turned and looked at Ruth Heller directly. "I'm sorry," she said. "Not the automatic version, the real one." Ruth nodded, pressing her lips together. "Thomas came to us the day after," she said. "Rode through a storm to come. He sat with Gus for 2 hours. Didn't say much, just sat." She looked at the counter. "A man who does that, you don't let a man like that lose his ranch to someone who never cared about a single thing in this county." "No," Clara said quietly. "You don't." Ruth picked up the knife again. Her hands were steady. "What do you need me to do?" she said. "Keep slicing," Clara said. "And when supper is served, sit next to old Daniel Marsh. I've been told he's the one people watch." Ruth looked at her with the same startled recalibration that Elliot had shown her multiple times, the look of someone encountering a degree of strategic clarity they hadn't anticipated. "You think of everything," Ruth said. "I try to," Clara said. "Someone has to." The room filled up by 5 o'clock. Clara heard it happen from the kitchen, the gradual accumulation of voices, the particular acoustic of 30 people in a space designed for a family. The sounds of neighbors who hadn't all been in the same room since last summer, finding each other again. She heard laughter from the front room, which was a good sign. She heard Thomas's voice moving through the crowd, and she heard the quality of it. Strong grounded the voice of a man on his own land, who knew every person in that room by name and history. She heard something else too. A voice she didn't recognize, smoother than the rest, that moved through the room with the particular ease of someone who was very good at moving through rooms he hadn't been invited into. She heard it asking questions, polite, interested. Sounding questions, the kind that seemed like conversation, but were actually reconnaissance. Briggs. She knew it without seeing him. She kept working. Elliot appeared in this kitchen doorway at 5:15. "We have a problem," he said low. She didn't look up. "Tell me." "Briggs got himself invited by Peterson," he said. "He's in the front room right now talking to the Garrity family. He's telling them, I heard it directly, that the bank in Billings has already made a decision. That the debt was called in last week and the sale to Duke is already proceeding. That tonight is—" He stopped. "The Last Supper," she said flatly. "Yes." She set down her spoon. She looked at Elliot. He was watching her face with the focused attention of a man who has learned that her face when she is working something out is worth watching. "Is it true?" she said. "About the bank?" "No," he said without hesitation. "I spoke to the bank manager personally by letter 10 days ago. The payment isn't due until March. Nothing has been called in." "Can you prove that?" she said. "I have the letter," he said. "My father has the original loan agreement." "Get them both," she said. "Now, before supper is served." He went. She picked up her spoon and went back to the stew, and she thought with cold clarity about what Briggs was doing in the front room, and what it would do to 30 ranchers who were already halfway between believing and wondering. A lie told convincingly enough at the right moment to the right people became true in the way that mattered in how people acted on it. By the time supper was served, if Briggs had his way, half the room would be sitting at Thomas Callahan's table out of pity rather than solidarity. And pity was worse than nothing. Pity meant the battle was already lost in everyone's mind. She would not allow that. She wiped her hands. She looked at the stove. Everything was timed correctly. Everything would be ready in 40 minutes. She had 40 minutes. She went to the front room. She had not been in the front room since the guests arrived. She was the cook, her place was the kitchen, and she understood that and had used it strategically, staying invisible while she needed to be invisible. But there were moments when invisibility was the wrong tool, and this was one of them. The room went slightly quieter when she appeared. Not entirely. 30 people don't go entirely quiet for one woman walking in from the kitchen. But there was a perceptible shift, the particular attention that comes when someone unexpected enters a space. She found Briggs immediately. How was exactly what she'd expected. Well-dressed, personable, the kind of handsome that came with money spent on it, standing near the Garrity family, with a glass of something in his hand, and an expression of relaxed confidence that was one of the more dangerous things she'd seen in her 25 years, because it was designed to look like the confidence of someone who had nothing to hide. She walked directly to him. He saw her coming and smiled the smile of a man who was not concerned by whatever was approaching. "Miss Whitmore," he said before she could speak. "The cook. I've heard wonderful things about the meals you've been putting together here." "Mr. Briggs," she said pleasantly, "I don't believe you were on the guest list." A small silence around them. Not large, but present. His smile didn't waver. "Peterson was kind enough to extend an invitation," he said. "I hope that's not a problem." "Of course not," she said. "Silver Creek is a generous table. Anyone's welcome." She paused. I did want to address something I heard you were telling people, though, about the bank and Billings. His expression shifted by a degree, still pleasant, just a degree less comfortable. I'm not sure I know what you mean, he said. I think you do, she said. She kept her voice conversational and her expression open because this was not the moment for confrontation, and she knew it. Confrontation in front of 30 ranchers would look like panic. What she needed to look like was certainty. The loan payment to the bank in Billings isn't due until March, and nothing has been called in. Elliot has the correspondence if anyone would like to see it. She looked around the room briefly, including everyone within hearing range. I mention it only because misinformation has a way of spreading before the truth can catch up, and I'd hate for anyone to leave tonight with an incorrect picture of where things stand. Briggs looked at her. She looked back. Of course, he said smoothly. I may have been working from outdated information. These things happen, she said with equal smoothness. Supper will be in about 30 minutes. I hope you'll stay. She went back to the kitchen. Her hands were shaking slightly when she got there, which she had not allowed to show and would not allow to show until she was alone. She gripped the edge of the counter for a moment, pressed her weight into it, breathed. Ruth Heller was watching her from the other side of the kitchen. That was something, Ruth said quietly. It was necessary, Clara said, and let go of the counter and went back to the stove. Elliot came back with the letters 5 minutes later. She told him briefly what had happened. He went very still when she described Briggs's expression after she'd addressed him, and then he said quietly, You knew he wouldn't admit it directly. Of course, she said. Admitting it directly would have made him look like what he is. This way he retreats gracefully, and the seed he planted is at least questioned, which is enough. She looked at Elliot. But we need old Daniel Marsh to see those letters before supper. Not as a formal presentation casually. Thomas shows them to him like he's sharing ordinary information. Marsh tells 2 people who tell 2 more. By the time the bread is on the table, the correct version of events has spread through the room. Elliot stared at her. How do you know how to do this? My mother taught me that a table is never just about food, she said. Everything that happens around it matters as much as what's on it. She reached past him for the serving spoon. Take those letters to your father. Tell him what I said about Marsh. Go. He went. The supper was served at 6 o'clock. She had been afraid in the back of her mind since the beginning that the moment of serving would be the moment when everything she'd built would be tested against reality, that the smells and the preparation and the careful planning would meet the actual food on the actual plates and fall short, and 30 people would eat politely and go home unchanged. The first signal that this was not going to happen came from old Daniel Marsh. I was served first as the eldest person at the table, and he took his first spoonful of stew with the careful deliberateness of a man who had eaten at a lot of tables and had strong opinions about all of them. Clara watched from the doorway of the kitchen. She had stayed in the kitchen deliberately because a cook who watches anxiously while her guests eat is a cook who has lost faith in her food, and she could not afford to look like that, but she could stand in the doorway and observe without being conspicuous. Marsh took the first spoonful. He took the second before the first had finished registering. Then he set his spoon down, which she had not expected, and he said loudly enough for the part of the table near him to hear, Lord Almighty Thomas, when did you hire a cook who actually knows what she's doing? Laughter. Real laughter, the warm kind. Thomas said, about 3 weeks ago. Best decision I've made in years. More laughter. And in the sound of it, she heard the room shift. Felt it shift, like a weather change you sense before you see it, from the carefully managed politeness of people who weren't sure what they were walking into to something more genuine, more relaxed. The particular emotional release of people who had been braced for difficulty and had found instead something genuinely good. She went back to the stove. The bread went out. All 3 varieties, and Ruth Heller's cornbread alongside, and she heard the reaction to that too. The sounds of people eating bread like they meant it, like it was the bread they'd been wanting all winter, which it probably was, because a Montana February was long and cold and monotonous, and a table with 3 kinds of bread, and a stew that smelled like it had been made with actual intention, was something people remembered. She heard conversations starting. Real ones, not the careful social maneuvering of the first hour, but the deeper register of neighbors who had stopped performing for each other and were actually talking. She heard Thomas's voice moving through it, strong and present, and Elliot's responding to questions she couldn't quite make out, and Ruth Heller's laugh, which was fuller than anything Clara had heard from her in the kitchen. She was plating the preserved vegetables when Elliot came back to the kitchen. "Marsh cornered me," he said, and there was something in his voice she hadn't heard before, a kind of lightness, careful and still tentative, but real. "He told me he'd heard what Duke's man had been saying in town, and he didn't believe a word of it, and if I needed a character witness at any point when it came to the bank, he'd ridden with the bank manager's father in the war, and his word carried weight." Clara looked up. "What did you say?" "I said I'd remember that," Elliot said. Then, Clara the Garrity's. The family Briggs was talking to. They just spent 20 minutes talking to my father about the spring cattle plans. Mr. Garrity offered to coordinate buyers through his cousin in Billings. He said he'd been waiting to see if the ranch was really standing before he offered. She set the platter down. "Now he's seen," she said. "Now he's seen." Elliot agreed. She looked at him steadily. He looked like a man who was revising something fundamental, not about the ranch, not about Duke, but about what was possible, about what 30 people eating a meal together could do that 30 separate conversations couldn't. "The preserves," she said. "It's time." His expression changed. Now, she said. "Go tell your father. He should be the one to bring them out, not me." Elliot was still for a moment. Then, "He'll understand why." "Yes," she said. "He will." She handed him the jar. Margaret Callahan's apple preserves, the one she'd set apart on the shelf in the storage room weeks ago, the one she'd saved for exactly this. He took it with both hands, the way you take something that matters, and looked at it for a moment. "She made this for a moment like this," he said quietly. "Didn't she?" "She made it for Silver Creek," Clara said. "For whatever Silver Creek needed it for." She paused. "I think this is what she had in mind." He carried it out to his father. She stood in the kitchen and listened. She heard Thomas's voice pause in whatever he was saying. She heard the quality of the silence that followed, not uncomfortable, not confusing, but the silence of recognition of 30 people picking up on something significant happening at the head of the table, without fully understanding yet what it was. Then she heard Thomas say clearly enough to Carrie, "My wife put these up. Margaret. Most of you knew her." A pause. "I found them in the storage room last week. Been sitting there waiting." Another pause, and in the pause, she could hear him managing something. "It's the right night for them." The silence again. Then the sound of the jar being opened, and the sound of it being passed, and then, and this was the thing she hadn't planned. The thing that happened, the way the best things happened, without engineering, the sound of old Daniel Marsh saying quietly, "Margaret Callahan made the finest apple preserves in 3 counties. I'd forgotten that." And after that, the conversation was different. She couldn't have said exactly how. The food was the same, the people were the same. Briggs was still somewhere in the room with his careful eyes and his retreated agenda. But the quality of what was happening had shifted into something that she recognized from years of watching food do its work at tables where it was needed. The shift from occasion to community, from performance to presence, from people being in the same room to people being together. It was what her mother had meant. It was what she had been trying to build for 3 weeks from a near-empty pantry and a dying man's kitchen, and the stubbornness of refusing to see something as finished before it was. She was standing at the stove with nothing left to do for the first time all day when she heard someone come into the kitchen behind her. She expected Ruth or Elliot. It was Briggs. He came in quietly without announcement and stood a short distance from her, and when she turned, she saw that his expression had changed significantly from the one he'd worn in the front room when she'd addressed him. The smooth confidence was still present, but underneath it, something else was showing, the expression of a man who has watched a plan fail in real time and is recalculating. "You're impressive," he said, and he said it without the social performance, as a plain statement. "Thank you," she said, equally plain. "Duke's not going to stop," he said. "I want you to understand that. Whatever happened tonight, and I'll tell you honestly, it wasn't what I expected. It doesn't change his position. He wants this land. He has resources you don't have, and he's patient." "I know," she said. "Then why?" he said. And for a moment, he sounded genuinely curious. The man underneath the agent asking a question the agent wouldn't have asked. "Why go to all this trouble for a ranch that isn't yours?" She looked at him. "Because nothing worth keeping is kept without trouble," she said. "And because the people in that room tonight are what this county is made of, and if Duke takes this ranch, he takes a piece of what they understand themselves to be." She paused. "You can tell him what you saw tonight. I'd recommend telling him accurately." Briggs was quiet for a moment. Then, "What did I see tonight? 30 people who came wondering," she said, "and are leaving certain. That's harder to work against than debt." He looked at her for a long time. Then he nodded once small, the involuntary nod of a man acknowledging something against his professional interest. He left. Elliot appeared in the kitchen doorway 30 seconds later, which meant he had been close enough to hear, and she knew from his expression that he had heard at least the last part. "He'll tell Duke," Elliot said. "Yes," she said. "And Duke will adjust his strategy." "Yes," she said. "We haven't won," he said. "No," she said. "But we haven't lost either. And 3 weeks ago, we were losing." She looked at him steadily. "That's not nothing, Elliot." He held her gaze. And then he did something she hadn't seen him do since she'd arrived. He crossed from the doorway to the stove, covered the distance without hesitation. No pause at the threshold. No consideration of whether to come in or stay out. He came in. He stood beside her at the stove, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him in the cold kitchen, and he said, "When this is over, when we've dealt with Duke and the bank and the spring, I want to talk to you about something." She kept her eyes on the stove. "What's something key about what happens next?" he said. "For you." A pause. "Here." The kitchen was very quiet. "Ask me in the spring," she said, "when we know how things stand." "I'm asking you now," he said. "Not about details. Just—" He stopped. Started again. "Just whether you'd be willing to hear it, in spring." She was quiet for a long moment. The sounds from the front room drifted through laughter voices, the movement of a full house of people who had arrived strangers to hope, and were leaving something closer to believers. "Ask me in spring," she said again. But her voice was different this time, softer at the edges. He heard the difference. "All right," he said quietly. "Spring." He stayed beside her at the stove, and she let him, and neither of them said anything else for a while, and the fire burned steady and warm in the Silver Creek Ranch kitchen, and outside the Montana night was cold and clear, and full of stars that had been there long before Harlan Duke decided he wanted something that wasn't his, and would be there long after. The last wagon left at 9 o'clock. When they were gone, Thomas Callahan sat down at his kitchen table and looked at Clara with the expression of a man who has just watched something he'd stopped believing in become real again. "Well," he said. "Well," she agreed. "Daniel Marsh shook my hand when he left," he said. "He told me Silver Creek was going to be fine." He paused. "Daniel Marsh hasn't told anyone anything was going to be fine since 1879. Elliot, leaning against the counter, said, "The Garrity offer is real. I talked to him for 20 minutes before he left. His cousin in Billings has buyers who need exactly the kind of cattle we're planning to move in spring. If the prices hold even half of what we need, the bank payment is manageable." Thomas nodded slowly, taking it in. "And Briggs," Thomas said. "Gone," Elliot said. "He'll send his report to Denver." He glanced at Clara. "Clara thinks Duke will adjust." Thomas looked at her. "You're not declaring victory," he said. "No," she said. "I'm not." "Good," he said. "Because Duke doesn't lose gracefully, and he doesn't lose finally. Tonight we gave ourselves room to fight. That's different from winning." "Yes," she said. "But it's the thing that makes winning possible." Thomas looked at his son. Elliot looked back. Something passed between them, the complex, rich look of two people who have a long and complicated history and are slowly and imperfectly finding their way back to the best of it. "I owe you an apology," Thomas said. Not to Elliot, to Clara. for the state of things when you arrived, for asking you to walk into something this difficult without telling you how difficult it was. You told me there wasn't much here, she said. I understood what that meant. Not the full extent of it, he said. No, she agreed. But I wouldn't have come any differently if you had, and I wouldn't leave any differently now. She started clearing the plates from the table methodically, the way she did everything, each action purposeful. Get some rest, Thomas. You were on your feet for 4 hours tonight, and you're still recovering whether you feel it or not. He stood up slower than he would have liked to. She could see the effort he was making not to show how much the evening had cost him physically, even as it had given him back something essential. He stopped at the kitchen doorway. Miss Whitmore, he said. She looked up. Whatever happens with Duke, he said. Whatever happens in spring. I want you to know that the best decision I made in the last 3 years, maybe longer, was writing those 12 words and sending them to Billings. She held his gaze. Get some rest, Thomas, she said quietly. He went. She stood in the kitchen and listened to his boots down the hall and the quiet close of his bedroom door. Then she stood at the sink and washed dishes and felt the day come off her in layers. The tension and the precision and the performance of confidence she'd maintained for 12 solid hours, coming down now into the simple, tired quiet of a woman who has done something hard and done it right. Elliot dried. She hadn't asked him to. He simply picked up the cloth when she put the first plate in the rack and started drying, and they worked through it in silence, and the silence was the same kind it had been since the first week. Full, not empty, the silence of two people who had said enough important things that the rest could wait. When the last dish was done, she dried her hands. She turned. Howe was looking at her with that expression, the one she'd watched develop over a month, from hostility to wariness to curiosity to this which didn't have a name yet, but was taking up considerable space in her chest and had been for longer than she intended to admit. Spring, she said firmly. He almost smiled. Spring, he agreed. She took her mother's cookbook from the windowsill and went to bed. She lay in the dark and listened to the ranch settle into its night sounds, and she thought about 30 people and apple preserves and an old man's handshake and a letter from Denver that had set all of this in motion, and she thought about a man who was still in the kitchen. She could hear him banking the fire, taking on, without being asked, the job of keeping the house warm through the night. She thought about spring. She thought, hold on. She thought, just hold on. And somewhere in the dark heart of the Montana winter, Harlan Duke sat in his Denver office and read Briggs's report, and his expression, people who knew him would have said, was not the expression of a man who had lost. It was the expression of a man who was revising, who was thinking about what came next, and what came next was worse than anything that had come before. But that was not tonight. Tonight the fire burned at Silver Creek Ranch, and it was enough. The letter from Harlan Duke arrived on a Monday. Not through the supply rider. Not through the ordinary post. It came by private courier, a man on a fast horse who knocked on the Silver Creek Ranch door at 7 in the morning and handed Elliot an envelope with Duke's personal seal, and was gone before Elliot had finished reading the first line. Elliot read it twice. Then he folded it and put it in his coat pocket and went to find his father. Clara was in the kitchen. She heard the knock and the brief exchange and the horse leaving, and she heard the quality of silence that followed the particular silence of Elliot standing in the hallway, reading something he had not been prepared to read. She kept her hands on the dough she was working and waited. He came to the kitchen doorway. She looked at his face and knew immediately that whatever was in the letter was not the adjusted strategy she'd been expecting. It was something worse. Tell me, she said. He took the letter out and set it on the kitchen table without a word. She read it. Duke's language was precise and cold. The language of a man who understood that the most dangerous threats were the ones that sounded like ordinary business correspondence. The substance of it was, this Duke had not been moved by the supper. He had not been moved by Carroll's revised report or Briggs's account of 30 ranchers eating well and going home with their opinions changed. What he had been moved by, the letter explained with calm specificity, was a conversation he had recently had with a senior officer at the Billings Bank, a conversation in which certain arrangements had been made that altered the timeline of the Callahan debt significantly. The payment due in March had been accelerated. It was now due in 6 weeks. Clara set the letter down. 6 weeks. In February in Montana, with cattle that couldn't be moved until the ground thawed, and buyers who weren't ready to commit until spring. 6 weeks was not enough time. 6 weeks was Duke telling them in the language of legal financial instruments that he had found the wall they hadn't known was there, and he had moved it. "Can he do this?" she said. "If he bought enough influence at the bank," Elliot said. "Yes." "Did he?" "The letter implies it." "Implying and doing are different things," she said. "Not by much," he said. "Not with someone like Duke." She looked at the letter again. Then she looked at Elliot. He was standing in the kitchen, not the doorway. He hadn't stood in the doorway in 2 weeks. She realized he had stopped doing that. Somewhere between the supper and this morning, without either of them marking the moment, and he was looking at her with an expression that was trying very hard not to be what it was, which was frightened. "Don't," she said. He blinked. "Don't what?" "Don't start making arrangements in your head," she said. "Not yet. Not until we know what's actually true, as opposed to what Duke wants us to believe is true." "Clara, 6 weeks is what he told us," she said. "That's designed to make us panic and make bad decisions in the panic. The first thing we do is verify whether it's actually true." She picked up the letter. "Who is the bank officer he spoke to?" Elliot looked at the letter. He doesn't say directly, but from context, he thought. There's only one senior officer at the Billings Bank who has the authority to alter payment schedules, a man named Whitfield. "Does your father know Whitfield?" "They've dealt together for 15 years. "Then Thomas writes to Whitfield today," she said. "Not asking about the acceleration that tells Duke we're scrambling. Thomas writes about the spring cattle plans, the Garrity connection, the buyers his cousin has lined up. He writes like a man who is managing his affairs confidently and wants to update his banker." She paused. "And in that letter, as an aside, he mentions that he received some correspondence suggesting a timeline change and assumes it's a misunderstanding." Elliot stared at her. "It forces Whitfield to respond," she said. "And the response will tell us whether Duke actually has the influence he's claiming or whether this letter is a bluff designed to make us collapse before we need to." "What if it's not a bluff?" Elliot said. "Then we deal with what's real," she said. "But we don't deal with what might not be real as though it's already decided." I was quiet for a long moment, looking at her face with that expression she had learned to read over the past weeks. The one that meant he was measuring something internally, assessing, and usually arriving somewhere close to where she already was. "All right," he said. "I'll talk to my father." "Now," she said, "before he hears about this some other way." He went. She stood in the kitchen and pressed her hands flat on the table and let herself feel for 60 seconds the full weight of what that letter represented. Because she had learned from her mother from years of managing in difficult circumstances that refusing to feel the weight of something didn't make it lighter. It just meant you were carrying it without knowing it, and that was more dangerous. You had to pick it up deliberately, feel how heavy it was, and then decide what you were going to do about it. The weight was considerable. 6 weeks. February. A man with more money and more connections and more patience than anyone should be allowed to have in a civilized territory, who had decided that Silver Creek Ranch was going to be his and had been working toward that conclusion for 10 years. The supper had bought them something Goodwill Community, the Garrity connection. Daniel Marsh's word, but Goodwill didn't pay bank debt. Community didn't satisfy a called-in loan. She picked up her mother's cookbook from the windowsill. She opened it. She hadn't opened it in front of anyone since she'd arrived. She read it privately, the way you read a letter from someone you love. Not for the information which you already know, but for the voice of it, for the reminder that the person existed and knew things, and thought you were worth leaving knowledge for. Her mother's handwriting was small and precise in the margins. Recipe notes adjustments. The pragmatic wisdom of a woman who had cooked for people in difficult circumstances her entire life, and had learned everything she knew the hard way. On the page for bean soup. The recipe she'd made that first night, her mother had written something she hadn't noticed the first time she'd read this page. A note added in different ink, darker, written later than the recipe itself. When you think you're out of options, you're usually out of the obvious ones. The real ones are always harder to see and worth more when you find them. Clara read it twice. Then she put the cookbook down and went to find Thomas, who was sitting with Elliot in the front room when she came in. The letter was on the table between them. Thomas's face had the look she hadn't seen in weeks, the grayish carved-out look of a man being pushed toward the edge of what he could hold. But his eyes were sharp. Whatever the fever had taken from him, it had given some of it back, and what she saw in his eyes right now was anger, clean and clarifying the anger of a man who has been patient for a very long time and has arrived at the end of his patience. "I need to tell you both something," she said. They looked at her. She sat down across from them. She had not sat in this room at this table in 5 weeks. The cook sat in the kitchen. But this was not a moment for the cook. This was a moment for the person who had been watching this situation from the inside longer than anyone, and had seen things that had not yet been said out loud. "Duke's strategy has always had a weakness," she said. "I've been thinking about it since the supper, since Briggs told me Duke was patient." She paused. Patient men depend on time. They build strategies that require time to work pressure that accumulates resources that run out. Opposition that tires. The reason Duke has been working on this ranch for 10 years is because time is his primary weapon. He uses it to wear people down until they make the decision he wants them to make. Thomas was watching her steadily. "Yes," he said. "That's exactly right." "The letter is designed to take time away from you," she said. 6 weeks instead of 6 months. It's designed to create panic and force a bad decision before you can use the time you had. She paused. "But the fact that he sent it tells us something." "What?" Elliot said. "That the supper worked," she said. "If it hadn't worked, if 30 ranchers had gone home unchanged, Duke would have waited. He wouldn't have accelerated. He accelerated because something happened at that table that he didn't plan for, and he's trying to get ahead of it before it becomes something he can't control." Thomas was very still. "The Garrity connection," Elliot said slowly. "And Daniel Marsh," Clara said. "And Gus Heller, and the 12 other families who came and ate and went home knowing what Silver Creek actually is." She looked at Thomas. "Duke spent 10 years making sure this ranch failed slowly and quietly without anyone paying too much attention. The supper made people pay attention. He can't let that stand." "So he's forcing our hand," Thomas said. "Yes," she said. "Which means we have to force his." Both men looked at her. "The water rights," she said. "Elliot mentioned them weeks ago. He said they were potentially the most valuable thing on this property. More valuable than the cattle, you said." She looked at Thomas. "Is that true?" Thomas blinked. She could see, surprised him. Taken the conversation somewhere he hadn't anticipated. "The creek on the north boundary," he said. "Year-round water, clean, reliable. In this territory that's—" He stopped. "Yes, that's worth significant money. I've had offers for access rights before." "From Duke," she said. Thomas paused. "Among others," he said carefully. "Has the land ever been formally surveyed for water value?" she said. "Not in the last 15 years, he said. "Not since the territory laws changed." "Then here is what I think," she said. "I think if you commissioned a formal survey of those water rights under current territorial law, you would find that the value of this property, the actual assessed value, is considerably higher than the number the bank is using to calculate your debt ratio." She paused. "And if the assessed value is higher, your debt ratio is lower, and the bank's grounds for acceleration become legally questionable." The room was very quiet. Elliot was looking at her with an expression she hadn't seen before. Not the revising look, not the moved look. Something more direct than either of those. "How do you know about debt ratios and assessed values?" he said. "My father was a surveyor," she said. "Before he died. I grew up listening to him explain land value to people who didn't understand why their property was worth what it was worth." She paused. "I wasn't planning to use that knowledge when I came here, but it's what's needed now." Thomas turned to Elliot. "Can we get a surveyor here in time?" he said. "Legitimate with territorial standing. Henderson's nephew in Billings," Elliot said, and he was already thinking she could see it, the quick practical calculation of a man whose mind moved fast when it had direction. He's certified. And he owes Thomas a considerable favor from 3 years ago. I remember the story. Henderson told it at the supper, actually. Thomas nodded. He'd come, he said. If I asked directly, he'd come. How long does the survey take? Clara said. Week, maybe less for the preliminary, Elliot said. Long enough to file a challenge with the bank on the acceleration grounds. File the challenge first, she said. Today by letter. On the grounds that you've commissioned a survey that may materially alter the property assessment. You don't need the survey results to file the challenge. You need proof the survey is in progress. Thomas looked at her for a long time. You came here to cook, he said. And the way he said it was nothing like the way Elliot had said it 5 weeks ago, cold and dismissive. It was wondering. Almost amused. Almost she thought something more than that. I came here to help, she said. This is what's needed. Thomas stood up. He was still moving with care, but it was the care of discipline now, not weakness. The deliberate movement of a man who knew his limits and was managing them instead of being managed by them. Elliot, he said, write 2 letters. One to Henderson's nephew, one to the bank. I'll sign both. He looked at Clara. And you, I need you to think about what else we're not seeing. Because you've been right about everything. I've been too close to see clearly, and I don't think we're at the bottom of it yet. She nodded. He left to rest and prepare. And Elliot pulled paper from the desk in the corner and sat down to write, and Clara went back to the kitchen and stood at the stove and thought. The letters went out that afternoon with a rider Elliot paid from the last of what he had in his wallet. Then they waited. Waiting was its own discipline. Clara had learned that too from her mother, that there was a particular courage required for the period between action and consequence, the period when you had done everything you could do, and the outcome was no longer in your hands. Most people filled that period with worry, which was useless, or with false confidence, which was dishonest. The right thing to do was keep working, keep the house running, keep Thomas eating and Elliot occupied, and the kitchen producing the small daily miracles that kept a household believing in itself. She planted the first seeds in the kitchen garden on a Thursday under cold frames she'd constructed from what she found in the storage room. Too early by most people's calculation. Right on time by hers, she had learned from her mother that seeds started early. Indoors protected were 2 weeks ahead by the time the ground was ready for them, and 2 weeks in this situation was the difference between a May harvest and a June one, and she was not in the business of waiting on June when May was achievable. Elliot found her there, hands in dirt. Early morning, the kind of cold that made breath visible and made working outside feel like a minor act of defiance. What are you doing? He said. Starting the garden, she said. It's February. I know what month it is, she said. Hand me that frame. He handed her the frame. Then he crouched down beside her and looked at what she was doing with the focused attention she'd come to know meant he was genuinely trying to understand something rather than questioning it. You planned this far ahead, he said. From the beginning. From the second week, she said. Once I knew Thomas was going to recover. You knew that in the second week. I knew it when he made a joke, she said. Sick men who are dying don't make jokes, they conserve. A man who still has enough left to be funny has enough left to fight. Elliot was quiet for a moment, crouched beside her in the cold. Clara, he said. She kept her hands in the dirt. It's not spring yet, she said. I know, he said. That's not. He stopped. Started again. I need to tell you something, and I need to tell you now, not in spring, because if I wait until spring, I'm going to spend the entire rest of winter not saying it, and I'm not good at not saying things anymore. You did that to me. She sat back on her heels and looked at him. I was looking at her with the directness she had come to value above most things, the look that had replaced permanently and completely the closed-off expression she'd first seen in the kitchen doorway 7 weeks ago. The look of a man who had stopped managing the distance between himself and things that mattered. Say it then, she said. I don't want you to leave, he said. Not when this is resolved. Not when Duke is handled and the bank is satisfied and the spring is here and you have every reason to move on to the next position somewhere else. He paused. I want you to stay, not as a cook, not as... He stopped. I'm not explaining this well. You're explaining it fine, she said. I haven't said the actual thing yet. I know what the actual thing is, she said. He looked at her. Elliot, she said, ask me in spring. You keep saying that. Because I mean it, she said. Not because I don't know my answer. Because when you ask me properly, I want it to be when this ranch is standing on its own and you're standing on your own in it, not when we're in the middle of a fight and everything is tangled up together. She looked at him steadily. Ask me when it's clear, so we both know what we're deciding. A long silence. You know your answer, he said. It wasn't a question. Ask me in spring, she said, and turned back to the garden. He stayed crouched beside her for another moment. Then he stood up and went back toward the house, and she heard faintly something that might have been a sound of relief. The response from the bank came 8 days later. Not from Whitfield, from the bank manager himself, which told them immediately that Whitfield had taken the challenge seriously enough to escalate it. The letter was formal and measured, and it said in the careful language of financial institutions covering themselves that the acceleration of the payment schedule was under review pending the results of the property assessment, and that the original March timeline would remain in effect during the review period. Elliot read it aloud at the kitchen table with Thomas sitting across from him and Clara standing at the stove, and the three of them were quiet for a moment after he finished. Then Thomas said, "He didn't have the influence he claimed. Or he had it and lost it when we challenged it formally," Elliot said. "Either way, we have until March." "And the survey," Clara said. "Henderson's nephew arrives Monday," Elliot said. Thomas looked at Clara. "You called his bluff," he said. "We called his bluff," she said. "All of us." "Don't do that," Thomas said firmly. "Don't spread it around to be modest. You saw it and we didn't. You saw it because you've been looking at this situation clearly from the first morning, and you haven't stopped." He paused. "I've been ranching this land for 30 years. My son has a lawyer's education. Neither one of us saw what a woman with a cookbook and good sense saw in 5 minutes." He held her gaze. "That deserves to be said plainly." Clara looked at the stove. "Thank you, Thomas," she said quietly. The survey took 6 days. Henderson's nephew, a young man named Arthur, serious and methodical, and quietly impressed by what he found on the north boundary, filed his preliminary report on a Friday. And when Elliot read it, he went very still for a long moment and then read it again. He brought it to Clara first. Not to Thomas, to Clara. She read it and understood immediately why he'd come to her, because the number in the preliminary report was not the number any of them had anticipated, even in the most optimistic version of the plan. The water rights alone under current territorial law assessed at a value that changed the debt ratio entirely. Not just reduced it, transformed it. The bank's grounds for any acceleration under these numbers were not questionable. They were non-existent. "This is real," she said. "Arthur is certain. He's conservative by training," Elliot said. "He said the preliminary is likely an understatement. The full survey will be higher." She set the report down. "Duke knew," she said. Elliot looked at her sharply. "What?" "Duke knew what the water rights were worth," she said. "He's known for years. That's part of why he wanted this land. Not just the cattle operation, the water. And he's been making sure the Callahans never had the land formally assessed under current law, because the moment they did, they'd realize what they actually had." She looked at Elliot. He wasn't trying to take a failing ranch. He was trying to take a valuable one before its owners found out it was valuable. The kitchen was very quiet. "Tell your father," she said. "Now, today." Thomas took the news, sitting at his kitchen table with both hands flat on the wood and his eyes fixed on the middle distance, and Clara watched him process it. 10 years of pressure, 10 years of managed decline, 10 years of a man believing his best days were behind him, and his land was worth less and less, and she watched it travel across his face, all of it, the anger and the grief, and underneath both of those, something that was returning from a very long distance. Pride. The particular pride of a man who built something real and has been reminded at the moment he most needed reminding that what he built was real. He knew. Thomas said the same words Clara had said, same quiet certainty. "Yes," Elliot said. All those years, Thomas said. He knew what this water was worth, and he let me believe. He stopped. His jaw tightened. He let me believe I was failing. He manufactured the failure so I'd sell before I ever found out. Yes, Elliot said again. Thomas was quiet for a long moment. Then he looked up at Elliot, and the expression on his face was one Clara had not seen before. Complex and painful and deeply fiercely loving, the face of a man looking at his son and seeing finally with full clarity what had been lost between them and what was being rebuilt. I should have done this 15 years ago, he said. The survey, the assessment. I should have known what I had. He paused. I should have made sure you knew what you were walking away from. Dad, Elliot said. The word came out without the careful management around it that had been there in the early weeks. Just the word, direct and unguarded. If you'd known, Thomas said. If I'd shown you the water and the land and what it was actually worth, not just to me, but on paper in numbers, would you have left the way you did? Elliot was quiet for a moment. I don't know, he said honestly. Maybe. I was 23 and I had things I needed to find out that I couldn't find out here. He paused. But I would have left differently, and I would have come back sooner. Thomas nodded slowly. I'm sorry, he said, for what I let you believe this place was. I'm sorry for what I said when I left, Elliot said. They looked at each other across the kitchen table. Two men who had spent 7 years on opposite sides of something that didn't need to be between them, finding their way back across it. One difficult, honest sentence at a time. Clara picked up her apron from the hook by the stove. I'm going to make supper, she said quietly. Neither man said anything, and she understood that was right, that this was a moment that belonged to them, and she was the person who had helped make it possible, and the best thing she could do now was step back from it and let it be what it was. She made supper. She made it well, the way she made everything with care and intention, and the knowledge that food prepared for people who needed something from it was never just food, had never been just food, would never be just food. Duke's formal response to the survey came 3 weeks later. It was not a letter. It was a withdrawal. No explanation, no acknowledgement of what had happened. Just the particular silence of a man removing himself from a situation that had stopped working in his favor. The legal equivalent of a door closing quietly designed to look like it had never been open. Elliot brought the document to Clara first. Again first to Clara. She read it. She set it down. She looked at him. It's over, she said. The bank confirmed this morning, he said. The original payment schedule stands. The assessment is on record. The debt ratio means he can't manufacture any more pressure through the bank. He paused. His lawyers sent a withdrawal of interest in the property. He's done. She looked at the document. 10 years of manufactured pressure, deliberate sabotage, coordinated manipulation, and it had ended with a piece of paper sitting on a kitchen table in a house that had been dying when she arrived and was not dying anymore. He'll find another way, she said, because she believed in being honest about things, even good ones. Maybe, Elliot said, but not this way. And we know what we have now. He can't use our ignorance against us anymore. She nodded. Clara, he said. She looked up at him. The morning light was coming through the kitchen window, and it caught him exactly the way she'd watched the light move through this kitchen every morning. For nearly 3 months, the way that made everything in the room look deliberate and warm and worth being in. It's spring, he said. She looked at him. I was right. It was not calendar spring. Montana was not ready to call it that, but the quality of the light had changed in the last week, and she had noticed it every morning from this window, the particular shift that meant the world was beginning its slow turn back toward warmth. Ask me then, she said. He crossed to where she was standing at the stove. No threshold, no hesitation, no pause at the edge, and he stood in front of her and looked at her, the way she had watched him learn to look at things over the course of these months, clearly without managing the distance, without the closed-off protection she'd first seen in the kitchen doorway. Stay, he said. Not as the cook, not as someone passing through. Stay here at Silver Creek with us. He paused. With me. She held his gaze for a long moment, She thought about a boarding house in Billings, and 12 words in an advertisement, and a 6-mile walk through a blizzard. She thought about a man on a floor, and 4 spoonfuls of broth, and a heel of old flour and bones that most people would have called worthless. She thought about her mother's cookbook, and Margaret Callahan's apple preserves, and a jar saved for the right moment. She thought about what it had cost her to walk away from everything she'd known, every time it stopped being enough, and what it felt like to stand in a kitchen that had, without her entirely planning it, become hers. She thought about her mother saying, "You feed people properly, and you're telling them they matter." She thought, "This is where I matter." "Yes," she said. It was a simple word. It was the most important word she had ever said. Elliot's expression did what faces do when something long feared impossible becomes real. A complete unguarded openness that he didn't try to cover or manage, and she was glad to see it. Glad he'd stopped managing things he didn't need to manage. He reached out and took her hand, just her hand, held carefully in both of his, and she let him. Thomas appeared in the kitchen doorway 30 seconds later, which told her he'd been close enough to hear, which she suspected he'd intended. He looked at the two of them, and his expression was the one she'd first seen on his face when she'd gotten him to laugh, that fragile, surprised return of something he'd believed was gone. "Well," he said. "Go away, Thomas," Elliot said without looking away from Clara. Thomas laughed. It was full and genuine, and completely without effort, the laugh of a man who has come back to himself and found that coming back was worth everything it cost. "Fine," he said. "I'll go check on the garden." "The cold frames need adjusting on the east side," Clara said. "The second one from the left." "I'll handle it," Thomas said. And she heard in his voice the thing she had been listening for since the first morning. The particular tone of a man who has reclaimed his own life and is finding to his relief that it fits. He went, and Clara stood in her kitchen because it was hers. Now she understood that finally and completely it had been hers since the first morning she'd lit the fire in it, and she held Elliot's hand and looked at the window and thought about all the things that were still ahead. The spring, the cattle, the garden that was already starting under the cold frames, the Garrity buyers, the water rights that would take years to fully understand and develop, the relationship between a father and a son that was still being rebuilt carefully and honestly, one conversation at a time. The work, always the work, which was never finished and was not supposed to be. She thought about her mother. She thought, "I found it. I finally found it. The place she was meant to feed. The people she was meant to matter to." 3 months ago, she had walked 6 miles through a Montana blizzard to a dying man's house and found an empty pantry and a family coming apart and a situation that every sensible person would have called impossible. She had looked at all of it, the bones and the dried herbs and the old flour and the man on the floor and the son in the doorway and the 10 years of manufactured failure, and she had seen not what was missing, but what was there. And what was there had been enough. It had always been enough. It had just needed someone who knew how to look. Silver Creek Ranch did not become the biggest operation in Montana Territory. It did not become wealthy in the way that wealth was counted in cities. What it became was something that lasted, something that held through hard winters and dry summers, and the ordinary disasters of a working life on difficult land, because it was built on the right foundation. Not money, not luck, but the knowledge of what it actually had and the people inside it who understood that what they had was worth fighting for. Clara Whitmore had arrived with a worn cookbook and calloused hands, and the particular kind of quiet that belongs to a woman who has survived enough to stop needing other people's approval to feel steady. She had fed a dying man back to life. She had fed a broken family back together. She had fed 30 neighbors into remembering what community meant. And in doing all of that, she had, without planning it, without looking for it, the way the best things always come, fed herself back into the world. She was home. That was not a small thing. That was in fact everything.